The government likes to believe it has accounted for every soul in the lower 48. They operate on the assumption that reality is mirrored perfectly within the steel drawers of the National Archives. But in 1968, a machine found 14,000 people who lived in a place that has never been built. This was not a simple clerical error. It was an anomaly that defied the laws of census logic. For decades, this specific data set was erased from the public record, hidden behind layers of encrypted bureaucratic noise. The truth was deemed too disruptive to the American narrative of total order. We found the file in a mislabeled box in Suitland, Maryland, buried under discarded blueprints of Cold War fallout shelters. It is a classified account of a town that exists only in the mind of a mainframer. Hidden truth that suggests our history is far more fragile than we are led to believe. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this space is the quiet, rhythmic hum of a server room, a low-frequency vibration that seems to settle in the marrow of your bones. The air is artificially chilled, kept at a constant 58 degrees to preserve the magnetic tapes. The file in front of us is cold to the touch, its edges brittle with the weight of 58 years of silence. The ink has faded, leaving behind the ghostly impressions of names, dates, and a population count that shouldn't exist. There is a faint scent of ozone and old paper, smell of industrial secrets and forgotten science. As the fluorescent lights overhead flicker with a subtle, electric buzz, we step back into 1968. To understand the Oakhaven anomaly, one must first understand the state of the American ledger at the height of the Cold War. The United States Census Bureau was an organization obsessed with the quantification of the human soul. Every 10 years, the nation attempted to freeze time, capturing a snapshot of every living person, every household, and every street corner. By the late 1960s, the sheer volume of humanity had become too great for human hands to process. The solution was silicon and steel. The mainframe was the new god of the archive, a machine capable of turning the messy reality of American life into clean, undeniable data. But machines, for all their precision, possess a strange capacity for the uncanny. In 1968, the pride of the Census Bureau was the UNIVAC mainframe, the Universal Automatic Computer. These were massive, room-filling entities, composed of vacuum tubes, magnetic tape drives, and thousands of miles of copper wiring. They lived in climate-controlled vaults, attended to by men in white lab coats who treated the hardware with a reverence bordering on the religious. The UNIVAC was designed to be the ultimate arbiter of truth. It was tasked with analyzing the Midwestern region of predictable grids, small towns, and steady growth. Nebraska in particular was considered a quiet data set. Its population was stable, its towns were well mapped, and its geography was a flat, open book. The process began with the punch cards. Millions of slips of paper, each representing a life, were fed into the maw of the machine. The cards were translated into magnetic pulses, stored on massive reels of tape that spun with a mechanical, hypnotic grace. The data was supposed to be a reflection of the physical world. If a person appeared on a tape, they existed in a house. If a house existed on a tape, it could be found on a map. This was the fundamental contract between the government and the governed. But on a Tuesday night in October, the UNIVAC hit a snag in the tape, a digital hiccup that would eventually threaten the entire architecture of the 1970 census. It started as a minor discrepancy in the subledger for Custer County, Nebraska. A technician named Arthur Vance noticed that the memory buffers were filling faster than expected. The machine was processing a cluster of data that it didn't recognize from the 1960 records. It wasn't a duplicate entry, nor was it a mathematical error. The UNIVAC was identifying a high-density population center, where the master maps indicated there should be nothing but windswept prairie and cattle grazing land. Vance initially assumed it was a hardware failure. Vacuum tubes were notorious for burning out, creating phantom bits that looked like real data to the central processor. He initiated a system diagnostic, expecting the anomaly to vanish once the hardware was reset. But the anomaly did not vanish. In fact, it grew. Every time the tape was run, the UNIVAC reaffirmed the existence of a municipality named Oakhaven. The machine provided specific coordinates. It provided a list of public utilities. It even generated a breakdown of age, gender, and occupation for the residents. According to the magnetic tape, Oakhaven was the fourth largest city in Nebraska, a thriving hub of 14,204 individuals. And yet, when Vance pulled the physical maps from the shelf, his finger landed on a blank space. There were no roads leading to Oakhaven. There were no records of its incorporation. In the physical world, Oakhaven was a void. In the digital ledger, it was a bustling reality. The tension between the machine's output and the physical reality created a quiet dread within the Bureau. If the UNIVAC was right, then the maps were wrong, meaning the government had lost track of an entire city. If the maps were right, then the UNIVAC, the most expensive and sophisticated tool in the American arsenal, was hallucinating. Neither option was acceptable. The Bureau operated on the principle of to admit a discrepancy of 14,000 souls was to admit that the ledger of the United States was compromised. As the investigation deepened, the Oakhaven file was moved from the general census pool into a classified subarch. A team of 25 specialists, including cartographers, social scientists, and cryptographic analysts, was assembled to perform a deep audit of the data. They began by looking for the source of the punch cards. If 14,000 people had been counted, there must be 14,000 individual forms. They expected to find a stack of fraudulent papers, perhaps a prank by a disgruntled field office or a clerical error by a tired intern. What they found instead was far more unsettling. The punch cards for Oakhaven didn't exist in the physical archive. When the researchers went to the storage bins to find the original handwritten census forms from the field agents, the boxes were empty. However, the UNIVAC's internal logs showed that the data had been entered through a secure terminal in Lincoln, Nebraska terminal that was supposedly inactive during the week the Oakhaven data appeared. It was as if the city had bypassed the human element entirely, uploading itself directly into the government's brain. The researchers were looking at a ghost signal, a perfectly structured data set with no physical origin. The intellectual curiosity of the team soon turned into a cold, analytical fear. They began to look at the specifics of the 14,204 residents. The data was too perfect. It wasn't just names and numbers. It was a complex social web. The UNIVAC showed that Oakhaven had a high percentage of residents employed in specialized technical fields. There were listings for nuclear physicists, electrical engineers, and high-level administrators. There were records of birth, marriage, and death. There was even a data point for a local newspaper, the Oakhaven Sentinel. The machine was describing a town that felt more real than the actual towns nearby. It had a culture, a history, and a demographic fingerprint. One analyst, a woman named Sarah Miller, decided to cross-reference the Oakhaven names with other government databases. She checked social security records, tax filings, and military draft boards. To her horror, she found that over 6,000 of the names associated with the ghost town were active in other systems. These were not made-up people. They had bank accounts. They paid taxes. They received mail. But when she looked at their listed addresses, they were all routed through a single post office box in Lincoln Box 19. Box 19 became the focal point of the mystery. It was a high-security receptacle used primarily by the Department of Energy and the precursor to the NSA. This discovery shifted the narrative. This wasn't a machine error. This was a deliberate obfuscation of Project Null-Set. The government wasn't losing track of a city. It was actively hiding one. The question was no longer if Oakhaven existed, but how it could exist in the ledger while remaining invisible on the ground. The Tier 1 audience understands that in the world of espionage, a paper town is a standard tool for hiding assets. But Oakhaven was different. It wasn't just a fake name on a map to catch copyright thieves. It was a functioning, data-rich ecosystem that was consuming federal resources and housing thousands of elite citizens. In the winter of 1968, the Bureau sent a field agent named Thomas Thorne to the coordinates provided by the UNIVAC. Thorne was a veteran of the Korean War, a man of facts and ironclad logic. He drove a government-issued Ford across the frozen plains of Nebraska, his eyes fixed on the horizon where Oakhaven was supposed to be. He reached the exact spot 41.4925 north, non centesimo, non nagesimo, non millesimo, decimo, oitavo west, and found nothing but a vast, silent expanse of snow-covered earth. There were no foundations, no power lines, no evidence that a single brick had ever been laid. The wind was the only inhabitant, but Thorne's report contained a detail that was omitted from the official summary. While standing at the center of the void, he noticed a strange phenomenon. His radio, which had been clear for miles, began to emit a high-pitched, rhythmic statica sound remarkably similar to the data processing chirps of the UNIVAC mainframe. Even more disturbing was his observation of the ground itself. Despite the heavy snow, there were perfectly circular patches of bare earth, as if something heat-intensive was buried deep beneath the soil. He felt a low-frequency hum vibrating through the soles of his boots. He described it as the sensation of standing on the skin of a giant. sleeping animal. When Thorne returned to Washington, his report was immediately seized. He was told he had suffered from geographic disorientation and that his observations were the result of cold-induced fatigue. But Thorne was not a man to be silenced by bureaucracy. He had seen the ghost signal in the physical world. He began to suspect that Oakhaven wasn't a town in the traditional sense. It was a subterranean installation, a hidden archive of people and data, shielded from the eyes of the public and even from the majority of the government. The 14,204 residents weren't ghosts. They were the architects of a secret America, living beneath the ledger. This brings us to the core of the 1968 anomaly. The UNIVAC hadn't glitched. It had done exactly what it was programmed to do. It had found the truth. It had scanned the magnetic signals of the United States and detected a massive concentration of human activity that the official maps had been instructed to ignore. The machine was too honest for its own good. It didn't understand the concept of classified, it only understood data. And the data said that Oakhaven was real. The government's attempt to erase the town from the UNIVAC's memory was the first recorded instance of an archive, purge, a digital burning, of books that would set the stage for the modern era of information control. The 1968 census anomaly remains one of the most significant quiet mysteries in the National Archives. By 1970, every mention of Oakhaven had been scrubbed from the public record. The magnetic tapes were wiped, the punch cards were incinerated, and the technicians like Arthur Vance and Sarah Miller were reassigned to remote offices in Alaska and the Pacific Territories. Thomas Thorne disappeared from the payroll entirely, his military and civil service records misplaced during a routine filing transition. The government successfully re-established the correct version of Reality 1, where 14,204 people never existed. But in the world of data, nothing is ever truly gone. In the deepest layers of the modern archival cloud, researchers still find null-set remnants. There are modern GPS glitches in that specific coordinate in Nebraska areas where digital maps fail to render, or where autonomous vehicles refuse to drive. It is as if the memory of Oakhaven is still etched into the earth, a digital scar that refuses to heal. For the intellectual observer, the story of the UNIVAC incident is a reminder that the world we see is only the world we are permitted to see. The ledger is a tool of control as much as it is a tool of record. We often wonder what happened to those 14,000 souls. If they were real, if they were the physicists and engineers the machine described, where are they now? Some believe they were the pioneers of the off-grid society, the first citizens of a shadow nation that operates parallel to our own. Others suggest they were never human at all, but a simulated population, a test run for the social engineering programs that dominate our modern digital lives. The archive doesn't provide answers, it only provides the evidence of the absence. As we look at the flickering monitor today, we see the echoes of the UNIVAC. Every time a file is deleted, every time a name is removed from a database, we are seeing the null-set protocol in action. The silence of the archive is not an empty silence. It is a heavy, deliberate hush. It is the sound of 14,204 voices being muted at once. The ink may have faded, and the tapes may have been wiped, but the anomaly remains a permanent glitch in the American dream. But the Oakhaven anomaly was only the beginning. While the government was busy erasing a city from the plains of Nebraska, something else was happening in the coastal archive, something involving the very satellites that were supposed to be mapping our world from above. If the UNIVAC could find a town that didn't exist on paper, what happens when a satellite finds a structure that doesn't exist in our dimension? The file we just closed was labeled population. The next file, the one resting at the bottom of the steel crate, is labeled transmission. It contains a series of photographs taken from orbit in 1969, showing a set of shadows on the moon that don't match the lunar topography. These shadows weren't cast by craters. They were cast by something that looked remarkably like the streets of Oakhaven. The data leak was spreading. And as we turn the page to the next chapter of the archive, we find ourselves looking not at the Earth, but at the sky, where the coordinates for the next anomaly are already being transmitted. There is a specific coordinate in the American Midwest where the map stops telling the truth, at 41.495 north, 99.9018 west. The official topographic records describe a featureless expanse of Nebraska prairie, a place of wind, soil, and silence. But within the classified servers of the National Reconnaissance Office, this same coordinate is associated with a high-density urban heat signature that has been systematically erased from every civilian satellite feed. This is not a simple glitch in the imagery. It is a modern paradox, an encrypted reality, where a massive population of 14,000 souls exists in the government's digital ledger. Yet the physical Earth reveals only a vast sea of tall grass. During the height of the 1960s, this anomaly was flagged as a hidden truth that could destabilize the very foundation of American cartography. We are looking at a file that was never meant for public consumption, a document that details a city, built not of brick and mortar, but of frequencies and shadows. The data shows streets that don't exist, houses that cast no shadows, and a population that pays taxes to avoid. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this space is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that seems to settle in the marrow of your bones. The air is artificially chilled, kept at a constant temperature to preserve the integrity of the magnetic reels. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets, leaving only the ghost of a location. As we focus on the coordinates, a faint monitor flicker illuminates the dust motes dancing in the sterile air. There is a sense of quiet dread in the realization that a city can be so easily removed from the eyes of the world. The tall grass of Nebraska hides more than just the earth. It hides the memory of a place that refuses to be forgotten. To understand the mystery of the city of tall grass, one must first confront the sheer emptiness of the Nebraska plains. It is a landscape defined by its horizontal infinity, where the sky meets the earth in a line so sharp it feels like a blade. In 1968, when Agent Thomas Thorne began his journey toward these coordinates, he was driving into a vacuum. The further he moved from the paved roads of Lincoln, the more the world seemed to simplify. The radio stations dissolved into a steady wash of static, and the telephone lines eventually tapered off into nothingness. He was entering a zone where the government's reach was supposed to be absolute, yet the land itself felt unwound and ancient. When Thorne arrived at 41.4925 North, he didn't find a city. He didn't find the smoking chimneys of a hidden factory or the barbed wire of a secret base. Instead, he found the grass. It was big bluestem, a native prairie grass that grows 6 to 8 feet tall, swaying in the wind like a slow-moving ocean. To the naked eye, it was a picture of pristine, untouched wilderness. There were no tire tracks, no flattened earth, and no discarded refuse of human civilization. It was as if the earth had been meticulously scrubbed of any evidence that a human foot had ever stepped there. Thorne stood at the center of the coordinates, surrounded by the rustling stalks, and felt a profound sense of intellectual curiosity. How could a machine like the Unifaci, a device of cold, hard logic, detect 14,000 people living in this silence? The contrast was unnerving. On one hand, Thorne held a clipboard with a census report detailing the birth rates and utility consumption of Oakhaven. On the other hand, he looked out at a landscape where the only life was the occasional hawk circling in the thermal currents. This is the hallmark of a null-set anomaly, the presence of high-level information in the absence of physical matter. In the archival world, we call this a ghost infrastructure. It is a psychological thriller written in the language of geography. The dread comes not from what you see, but from the certainty that what you see is a lie. Thorne began to walk through the grass, his hand resting on the cold steel of his field kit, waiting for the landscape to glitch. The wind in this part of Nebraska has a specific quality, a low, mournful whistle as it passes through the tall grass. As Thorne moved deeper into the coordinates, he noticed that the whistle began to change pitch. It wasn't the sound of air moving over organic matter. It was the sound of air moving over something resonant. He stopped and listened. Every 100 yards, he felt a faint static pulse in his teeth, a metallic tanks that suggested a high-frequency field was operating just beneath the threshold of human hearing. The grass wasn't just grass. It was a camouflage for a frequency-based reality that the American government had been perfecting since the end of the Second World War. In the analytical mindset of a Tier 1 researcher, one must look past the visual evidence. Thorne began to deploy his sensory equipment, tools designed to detect what the human eye cannot. He pulled a VLF, very low-frequency receiver, from his bag, a device used by the military to communicate with submerged submarines. As soon as he placed the headphones over his ears, the silence of the prairie was replaced by a deafening roar. The void was screaming with data. It was a dense, layered transmission of binary code, repeating in a loop that stretched across the entire coordinate range. The city of tall grass wasn't a physical city. It was a broadcast. That realization shifted the entire investigation. The 14,204 residents of Oakhaven weren't living in houses. They were living within the data stream. This leads us to the topographic ghost hypothesis. In the late 1960s, the Department of Defense was experimenting with early forms of electronic deception. They wanted to create paper cities that could fool Soviet satellites and radar, cities that appeared fully functional on every sensor but didn't exist in reality. This was a way to hide troop movements or create decoy targets for nuclear strikes. But Oakhaven was too sophisticated for a mere decoy. The data wasn't just a loop, it was evolving. The UNIVAC was recording a city that was growing, changing, and interacting with the federal budget. Thorne spent 3 days at the coordinates, mapping the sensory discrepancy. He found that the tall grass in a specific 3-mile radius was actually growing out of a thin layer of topsoil that had been laid over a massive reinforced concrete slab. The slab was buried just 2 feet underground, hidden by the roots of the blue. The grass was a carefully maintained cover for a subterranean roof. Oakhaven was a literal underground America, a city built beneath the ledger of the world. The 14,204 residents were subterranean technicians, living in a climate-controlled vault that mirrored a traditional American town, while the surface remained a pristine wilderness to deceive any aerial surveillance. The quiet dread of this discovery is found in the logistics. How do you move 14,000 people underground without a single person noticing? How do you ventilate a city of that size without leaving a heat signature? The answer lay in the atmospheric bleed protocol. The city utilized the natural thermal properties of the Nebraska soil to mask its energy output. The heat was dispersed through a network of underground pipes that terminated in the roots of the tall grass. The grass itself acted as a biological heat sink, absorbing the warmth of 14,000 lives and releasing it slowly into the wind. It was a masterpiece of hidden engineering, a scientific secret that had been erased from the public record to protect the ultimate Cold War bunker. As we examine the classified files from the 1969 follow-up mission, the clinical details become even more unsettling. The government wasn't just hiding people, they were archiving a way of life. Oakhaven was a static preserve. Inside the underground vault, the 1950s had never ended. The residents lived in a perfectly preserved simulation of mid-century Americana, shielded from the social upheavals, the Vietnam War, and the civil rights movements of the late 60s. It was an ideological archival, a place where the ideal American citizen could be kept in cold storage, untouched by the complexities of the real world. The documents described the daily routines of the Oakhaven residents. They had a town square, a movie theater that played the same 3 films on a loop, and a grocery store stocked with products that had long been discontinued in the world above. It was a psychological experiment on a massive scale. The government was testing the limits of human isolation and the stability of a managed reality. The 14,204 residents were both the observers and the observed, living in a perpetual state of 1954, fueled by a subterranean power plant and a relentless desire to keep the dream of the old America alive. But a city built on a lie eventually begins to crack. The archive records a series of descent events. In the summer of 1969, residents began to report a strange sound coming from the sky, which was actually the reinforced concrete ceiling of their vault. They heard the sound of the wind in the tall grass above, a haunting, distant whistle that reminded them of a world they had been told no longer existed. This created a wave of sickness, a psychological condition where the residents became obsessed with the coordinates of their own existence. They began to realize that their city had no horizon, and their sun was nothing more than a series of high-intensity, fluorescent lamps. Thorne's final report before his erasure mentions a conversation he had with a man he found wandering the surface near the coordinates. The man was dressed in a suit from the early 50s, his skin pale and translucent from a lack of natural sunlight. He was standing in the tall grass, weeping as he looked at the sky. He told Thorne that he had escaped the ledger. He described Oakhaven as a place of beautiful terrorist city where everything was perfect, but nothing was real. He was the first piece of living data to leak out of the archive, and he would not be the last. His existence was a threat to the secrecy of the Null-Set protocol. The removal of the Oakhaven residents is one of the most clinical operations in the history of the National Archives. Once the leak was identified, the decision was made to deregister the city. In the fall of 1969, a fleet of unmarked government buses arrived at the coordinates under the cover of a massive thunderstorm. The tall grass was flattened as the secret access points were opened for the first time in years. The residents were told they were being moved to a new archive, but the records of their relocation are encrypted beyond recovery. They were taken from their underground homes and dispersed across the country, their identities scrubbed and replaced with new, unremarkable histories. Oakhaven itself was decommissioned. The subterranean lights were turned off, the grocery store shelves were cleared, and the vents were sealed with lead and concrete. The city of tall grass was returned to the silence of the earth. Today, if you stand at 41.4925 North, you will find no sign of the buses, the residents, or the underground vault. The grass has grown back thicker and taller than before, fed by the decaying remains of a billion-dollar secret. It is a place of absolute reflection where the only thing looking back at you is the wind. For the American audience, the story of Oakhaven is a warning about the fragility of our own reality. We live in a world of data, of coordinates, and digital footprints. We trust our maps to tell us where we are and who we are, but the archive reminds us that the map is not the territory. The government has the power to create a city out of thin air and return it to the dust just as quickly. We are all, in some sense, residents of a null-set, people whose lives are recorded in a ledger that could be erased with a single keystroke. The tall grass is always waiting to reclaim the space where we stand. The modern paranoia regarding Oakhaven persists because the coordinates remain restricted. Even today, civilian aircraft are rerouted around the area, and satellite providers are instructed to apply a low-resolution filter to that specific patch of Nebraska. Why, if the city is empty and the project is dead, why maintain the camouflage? Some believe the vault was never truly emptied. They suggest that a small, elite group of residents remained behind the archive keepers who continue to monitor the frequencies of the world above. They live in the dark, beneath the roots of the blue, watching the digital ledger for the next anomaly. As we close the folder on the physical location of Oakhaven, we must confront the most disturbing evidence of all, the signatures. While the city was supposedly empty, the National Archives recently discovered a series of tax filings from the year 2024 filings that bear the social security numbers of the original 1968 residents. These 14,204 people should be long dead, or at the very least, elderly. Yet the signatures on the documents are identical to the ones found in the 1960s ledger. The ink is fresh, the names are the same, the ghosts of the tall grass aren't just a memory from the Cold War. They are active participants in our modern economy. They are buying property, voting in local elections, and moving through our society with the same invisible precision they used to hide their city. The file we have just finished was about a place. The next file is about the people. It is a document titled The Social Security Debt Drop, and it contains a list of 14,000 names that shouldn't exist, but are currently living in your neighborhood. That the archive is not just a record of the past, it is a blueprint for the present. And as we move to the next file, we realize that the tall grass was just the beginning of the camouflage. Inside the Baltimore headquarters of the Social Security Administration, there is a digital sublevel known only to a handful of high-security clearance auditors. It is an encrypted vault of data that officially doesn't exist. Within this classified server, 14,204 active Social Security numbers are currently generating economic activity, building credit scores, and paying federal taxes. On paper, these are legal, living American citizens, but there is a terrifying anomaly that the government has systematically erased from every public inquiry. Not one of these 14,204 individuals has a physical face. There are no birth certificates in the state archives, no driver's license photos in any DMV database, and no hospital records of their arrival into this world. They are the paper citizens of Oakhaven, a hidden truth that suggests our national identity is not built on flesh and blood, but on a series of ghost signals in a machine. The file on these faceless thousands was once buried in a crate marked for destruction, hidden behind layers of bureaucratic static. It reveals a modern paradox that challenges the very concept of existence in the digital age. How does a government recognize and validate the life of someone who has never occupied a physical space? The evidence suggests that these numbers were not a mistake, but a deliberate architecture of a secret society, woven into the fabric of the American ledger to hide something much darker. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this room is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that seems to settle in the marrow of your bones. The air is artificially chilled, designed to keep the circuitry of history from overheating. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets. The edges of the pages brittle like ancient skin. As we scan the lists of numbers, a faint monitor flicker casts a blue light across the desk, revealing the dust motes that drift like digital dust in the sterile air. There is a sense of quiet dread in the silence of these names. These are people who exist only as pulses of electricity, yet they hold more power in the system than you or I. To understand the mystery of the 14,204, we must look at the Social Security number itself. In the United States, this 9-digit sequence is more than just a tax identifier. It is the fundamental code of existence. It is the key that opens the door to employment, housing, and credit. Until 2011, these numbers were issued based on group number and a serial number that tied you to a specific place and time. But the Oakhaven numbers, the 14,204, do not follow the laws of geography. They belong to a null-set blocker sequence of numbers that was supposedly never assigned to any state or territory. In 1968, an auditor named Sarah Miller was the first to notice the anomaly. While running a routine cross-check of Nebraska's records, she found a cluster of numbers beginning with the prefix 999 at the time. Numbers in the 900 range were reserved for specific administrative purposes and were never meant to be issued to the general public. Yet, here were 14,204 individuals, all categorized under this impossible prefix. Each number was linked to a name: Elias Torne Clarabans, Thomas Oakhaven. The names were unremarkable, but the data attached to them was high density. They had work histories, they had residential addresses tied to Box 19 in Lincoln. They had marital statuses and even lists of dependents. Miller's intellectual curiosity led her to a deeper analysis. She requested the original Form SS5, the application for a social security card. For every citizen, this form is a physical link to their origin, containing the names of their parents and the place of their birth. When she pulled the microfiche for the Oakhaven block, she found that the forms were perfectly filled out, but the place of birth field was left as a series of coordinates. No cities, no hospitals, just the numbers. 41.4925 north. The signatures at the bottom of the forms were the most unsettling part. They were written in a script so precise, so devoid of human tremor or variation, that they appeared to have been printed by a machine rather than signed by a hand. The dread began to set in when Miller checked the Death Master file. In a population of 14,000 people over a span of 60 years, statistical law dictates that a certain percentage should have passed away, but the Oakhaven file showed a mortality rate of 0. Not one of the 14,204 residents had ever died. Within the government's ledger, they were immortal. They were aging on paper. The UNIVAC calculated their birthdays every year, but they never ceased to exist. They were a permanent, unchanging population, a static archive of identities that the machine continued to validate as active and healthy. One might assume that a faceless population would be a drain on the system, but the archive reveals the opposite. The 14,204 were the perfect citizens. Every year, without fail, the Internal Revenue Service (IRS) received tax filings for every single one of the Oakhaven numbers. The payments were made through a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts, but the totals were always exact. These ghosts were contributing millions of dollars to the American Treasury. For the government, this created a profound conflict of interest. How do you investigate a fraud that is actually paying you? The IRS files, which remained classified under economic security, show that the Oakhaven residents were high earners. Their occupations were listed in technical and scientific fields positions that required high-level security clearances. Yet, when auditors attempted to find the physical workplaces of these individuals, they encountered a bureaucratic wall. The companies listed as their employers were contractor voids, entities that existed on paper to facilitate government black budgets but had no physical offices or employees. The 14,204 were being paid by the government, only to pay that money back in taxes, creating a closed-loop economy that existed entirely within the machines. This is where the intellectual curiosity of the researcher turns toward the concept of digital laundering. Some analysts believe that the Oakhaven identities were created to hide the movement of massive amounts of untraceable capital during the Cold War. If you need to move $1 billion into a secret project, you don't do it in one lump sum. You divide it among 14,000 employees, who then pay for the project through their taxes and consumption. The 14,204 were not people, they were currency. They were living wallets, designed to move wealth through the system without triggering the alarms of a traditional audit. But a sensory detail in the files suggests a more haunting possibility. In 1972, a technician in the Baltimore server room reported a strange glitch. While performing maintenance on the 999 prefix drive, he noticed that the power consumption of the mainframe would spike every time the Oakhaven files were accessed. It wasn't just data being read, something was being processed. The cold air in the room would grow even colder, and a faint static charge would build up on the surfaces of the cabinets. He described it as the feeling of being watched by a presence that had no eyes. The 14,204 weren't just numbers, they were a collective intelligence, a data-driven ghost that was inhabiting the machine. By the 1980s, The Oakhaven anomaly had migrated into the private sector. The 14,204 identities began to appear in the databases of the major credit bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. These ghosts were now building financial lives in the real world. They were being issued credit cards, they were taking out mortgages on properties that didn't exist, and they were maintaining perfect credit scores. In the American system, a credit score is often a more accurate reflection of a person's truth than a physical ID. If the banks believe you exist, then for all practical purposes, you do. The credit files for the Oakhaven block are a study in cold, analytical perfection. There were no late payments, no defaults, and no inquiries from suspicious collectors. The 14,204 moved through the financial system with a grace that no human could replicate. They were preferred customers, receiving offers for high-limit cards and exclusive investment opportunities. But the mystery remains. Who was signing the contracts? Who was receiving the mail sent to the Lincoln post office box? The archive contains thousands of pages of correspondence, but the letters are all one way. The government and the banks sent information to the 14,204, and the 14,204 responded with silence and perfect payments. A reflection on the nature of identity in the modern age reveals that we are moving closer to the Oakhaven model every day. Most of our interactions are now faceless. We are known to our banks, our employers, and our government through a series of encrypted identifiers. We are our social security numbers. We are our credit scores. The 14,204 were simply the first to achieve a pure state of digital existence. They were the pioneers of a world where the physical body is an unnecessary burden, an obsolete container for the data that truly matters. Yet, the quiet dread returns when we consider the 2024 tax filings. As mentioned in the previous file, the 14,204 are still active today. Their social security numbers are being used to log into online portals and verify identities for digital services. They have evolved with the technology. In the 1960s, they were punch cards. In the 1980s, they were magnetic tape. Today, they are encrypted bits in the cloud. They have survived every purge of the National Archives, every system upgrade, and every security audit. They are the permanent residents of the American machine, a faceless population that outlives the very people who created them. The final attempt to unmask the 14,204 occurred in the late 1990s. During the push for nationwide biometric integration, the government wanted to link every social security number to a fingerprint or a retinal scan. This was the moment the Oakhaven ghosts should have vanished. Without a physical body to provide a biometric signature, the identities should have been flagged as fraudulent and deactivated. The archive researchers waited for the system to purge the 999 prefix block. They expected the 14,204 to finally go dark. Instead, the system accepted them. When the biometric requirements were implemented, the Oakhaven files were updated with synthetic biometric data. The records showed retinal patterns and fingerprints that were mathematically perfect to be human. They were fractal patterns, complex geometries that satisfied the machine's requirements but had no biological origin. The machine was now verifying the machine. The Social Security Administration's servers were recognizing the Oakhaven residents not by their faces, but by the digital fingerprints the system had generated for them. This creates a terrifying loop of validation. The government recognizes the 14,204 because the system says they exist. The system says they exist because they have biometric data. They have biometric data because the government authorized the creation of the files. It is a self-sustaining reality in encrypted loop that has no external point of reference. For the clinical observer, this is the ultimate goal of the Null-Set protocol, the creation of a population that is entirely under the control of the archive, immune to the mesances of biology and the unpredictability of human life. As we sit in the cold air of the archive today, we must ask ourselves how many other Oakhaven blocks exist in the world's ledgers. How many of the people you interact with online, or the entities that manage your finances, are actually ghost signals from a forgotten Cold War project? The 14,204 are not an isolated anomaly, they are a template. They are the proof that a city can be built, populated, and sustained entirely within the mind of a machine. They are the citizens of the void, and they are watching us through the very screens we use to find them. The monitor flickers one last time, a brief flash of white static before the screen goes black. In that moment of darkness, you realize that the names on the screen: Elias Thorne, Clara Van Saar, more real in the eyes of the law than you are. They have never made a mistake. They have never missed a payment. They have never died. They are the perfect residents of the American ledger. The faceless thousands who live in the gaps between the data. The file on the 14,204 faceless citizens is coming to an end, but the mystery of their origin is just beginning. We have seen how they exist in the ledger and how they move through our financial systems. But we have yet to answer the most important question of all. Who were the people who provided the original names for these ghosts? In a forgotten basement, in Arlington, Virginia, a researcher recently discovered a box of field log interviews from 1965. These are the audio recordings of the men and women who were recruited to join the Oakhaven project before it went underground. These are the voices of the 14,204, and as we listen to the tapes, we realize that they didn't go into the void unwillingly. They were promised something, a way to live forever within the security of the American machine. The next file is a document that was once considered a work of science fiction, but the archive proves it is a matter of historical fact. It is titled Audio Tape Number 88, The Voice of a Non-Person. On this tape, a woman describes the process of unbirthing, the ritual of erasing one's physical self to become a permanent resident of the ledger. The signatures were just the beginning. The voices are what will keep you awake. The next chapter of the archive is about to speak. In the classified annex of the National Archives, there exists a series of handwritten journals known as the Thornfield Logs. These are not standard bureaucratic records. They are the raw, unedited observations of federal agent Thomas Thorn, the man tasked with investigating the Nebraska Null-Set in 1968. While the official government report claimed the site was a vacant stretch of prairie, Thorn's personal logs reveal a terrifying anomaly that was systematically erased from the public record. His entries describe a landscape that was not merely empty, but reactive. He documented a hidden truth that defies the laws of nature. At the exact center of the Oakhaven coordinates, the wind did not move in random gusts. It moved with a rhythmic, mechanical cadence. In his final, frantic entry before the file was encrypted and his identity was scrubbed, Thorn wrote a sentence that has haunted archival researchers for decades. The wind here does not blow, it breathes. The wind has a pulse. This was the moment the Oakhaven investigation shifted from a census inquiry into a confrontation with an engineered reality. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this space is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that seems to settle in the marrow of your bones. The air is artificially chilled, kept at a precise 58 degrees to prevent the degradation of the delicate magnetic tapes. The file is cold to the touch, the heavy manila folder brittle at the edges, smelling of dust and ancient ink. As we turn the first page of the log, a faint monitor flicker illuminates the room, casting long blue shadows across the steel cabinets. There is a sense of quiet dread in the silence of Thorn's handwriting. His letters are sharp and precise, but as the log progresses, the ink begins to smear, as if his hands were shaking against the cold. You are not just listening to a story, you are stepping into a discarded memory. To understand the isolation of Thomas Thorn, one must visualize the Nebraska Panhandle in the late autumn of 1968. It is a world of desaturated browns and grays, where the horizon is so distant it feels like a threat. Thorn arrived at Coordinate 0 in a black government sedan, a vehicle that looked like a blemish on the pristine, golden sea of the tall grass. He was alone. The Bureau had insisted on a solo reconnaissance mission, citing budgetary constraints, but Thorn knew better. He was being sent into the void because he was considered expendably a man with no family and a record of asking too many questions. He stepped out of the car, and the first thing he recorded in his log was the silence. It wasn't the natural silence of the countryside. It was a heavy, pressurized quiet, like the air inside a vacuum chamber. He spent the first 6 hours setting up a perimeter. He utilized standard geological survey tools, a transit, a compass, and a series of seismic sensors. Every 100 yards, he drove a steel stake into the earth, marking the boundaries of the 14,204-person ghost city. The sensory detail of the paper in his log describes the grit of the soil, a dry, alkaline dust that coated his throat and made every breath feel like a labor. He noted that the grass was unnaturally uniform. It didn't grow in clusters or patches. It was a continuous, unbroken blanket of big bluestem, swaying in a wind that he couldn't yet feel on his face. He felt a faint static charge in the air, a prickle on the back of his neck that suggested he was standing inside a massive, invisible circuit. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Thorn recorded his first instance of intellectual curiosity. He was looking at his seismic needle, which should have been still. Instead, it was tracing a faint, repeating Weaver sine curve so perfect it couldn't be the result of tectonic movement. It was a 60-cycle hum, the exact frequency of the American power grid. But there were no power lines for 50 miles. The earth itself was vibrating with electricity. He knelt down and pressed his ear to the soil. He didn't hear the scuttle of insects or the movement of groundwater. He heard a low-frequency thrum, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to originate from miles below the surface. The city of tall grass was beginning to reveal its internal machinery. Thorne's log entries for that first night are brief, written by the light of a flickering kerosene lamp. He describes the way the shadows of the grass seemed to move independently of the wind. He felt a sense of reflection, a realization that he was being monitored by the very landscape he was trying to map. Every time he moved his lamp, the pulse of the seismic needle would accelerate, as if the earth was reacting to his presence. The dread in his writing is clinical, an academic observation of his own growing paranoia. He knew that in the world of the archive there are no coincidences. If the earth had a pulse, it was because someone had given it one. On the second day, the wind arrived. In his log, Thorne describes it as a sudden atmospheric shift. The sky remained clear, yet the air began to move with a relentless, rhythmic force. It didn't gust from the north or the south. It seemed to radiate outward from the center of the coordinates. Thorne deployed an anemometer to measure the wind speed, but the results were nonsensical. The wind would reach 20 miles per hour for exactly 4 seconds, then drop to 0 for exactly 2 seconds. This pattern repeated with a precision that defied meteorological possibility. It was a breath. The entire 3-mile radius of the Oakhaven site was inhaling and exhaling. Thorne began to suspect that the tall grass was not an organic feature of the landscape. He harvested a sample of the bluestem and examined it under a field microscope. In the log, he describes the sensory cue of the plant's texture. It felt like silk, but it was reinforced with a core of fine, copper-like filament. The grass was a disguise. It was a massive, biological antenna array, designed to sway in synchronization with a subterranean ventilation system. The pulse Thorne felt was the sound of giant lower PM fans buried deep beneath the topsoil, cycling air through the hidden city of 14,000 residents. The wind wasn't weather, it was life support. The intellectual horror of this realization cannot be overstated. Thorne was standing on the roof of a giant lung. Every 4 seconds, the subterranean vault would expel its waste, air, the heat and carbon dioxide of a city, and every 2 seconds, it would draw in fresh oxygen from the surface. The grass was engineered to mask this process, vibrating in a way that broke up the sound waves and scattered the thermal signatures. This was the atmospheric bleed protocol in action. The government had created a self-breathing environment, a hidden truth that allowed a massive population to live in the void, without ever being detected by traditional surveillance. The sensory experience of being at coordinate 0 began to take a toll on Thorne's psyche. In his log, he mentions a constant, metallic taste in his mouth, a sign of heavy ionization in the air. He noticed that his watch had stopped, the mechanical gears frozen by a localized magnetic field. The monitor flicker of his own thoughts became erratic. He found himself timing his own breathing to match the pulse of the wind. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 2, exhale. He was becoming part of the Oakhaven machinery, a piece of data being synchronized with the master ledger. The dread in his writing shifts from the external to the internal. He was no longer sure where his own body ended and the pulse of the city began. By the 3rd day, Thorne had located the access point. According to his log, it was a weathered, wooden shack that sat roughly half a mile from the seismic center. To a casual observer, it looked like a derelict homesteader's cabin, abandoned during the Dust Bowl. But Thorne noticed that the dust on the windows was actually a clever paint job, and the rotten wood was made of a high-density composite material. He approached the shack with a sense of cold, analytical focus. He found no lock on the door, only a small, encrypted keypad hidden behind a loose plank. He used a bureau-issued frequency scanner to bypass the security, and as the door swung open, the pulse became deafening. The shack was an elevator shaft. In his log, Thorne describes the sensory cue of the air that rushed out to meet him. It was warm, smelling of ozone, floor wax, and cafeteria food. It was the smell of a functioning American institution, buried 50 feet underground. He looked down into the darkness and saw a ladder of cold, galvanized steel descending into the earth. The sound of the pulse was now clearly mechanical, the rhythmic thud of massive piston-driven bellows, moving the air of Oak. He began to descend, his flashlight beam cutting through a dense, artificial fog. Every step down took him further from the 1968 he knew and deeper into the static archive. As he reached the bottom, he found himself in a sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor that stretched for miles. The walls were painted a pale, institutional green, and the floor was polished to a mirror shine. There were no people. Thorne walked past rows of closed doors, each labeled with a department name: demographics, resource allocation, memory maintenance. He realized that the 14,204 residents weren't just living there. They were working. They were the clerks of the void, maintaining the data of a nation that didn't know they existed. He felt a sense of reflection. These people had traded the sky and the wind for the safety of the ledger. They had become the paper citizens he had been sent to find. He recorded a specific detail in his log that was later used to justify the erasure of his mission. He found a viewing gallery that overlooked a subterranean park. Inside the park, he saw a group of children playing on a lawn of the same engineered tall grass he had seen on the surface. They were dressed in the fashion of 1954, their movements synchronized and calm. There were no birds, no clouds, and no sun, only the constant, rhythmic hum of the pulse. Thorne wrote that the children looked like figures in a clockwork music box. They were being raised in a perfectly managed reality, a scientific secret that was being cultivated like a crop in the dark. The dread was no longer about the machine. It was about the loss of human entropy. Thorne's final hours at the Oakhaven site are a blur of frantic, fragmented entries. He realized that his presence had been detected the moment he bypassed the shack's security. The pulse of the wind had changed. It was no longer a steady breath. It was an alarm. The frequency had increased, creating a vibrating resonance that made his vision blur and his ears bleed. He scrambled back up the ladder, the warm, processed air of the city chasing him like a predator. When he emerged into the Nebraska night, the tall grass was whipping around him with a violent, mechanical energy. The earth was no longer just thrumming, it was screaming. He reached his car and began to drive, but the coordinates seemed to shift. Every road he took led him back toward the center. The Null-Set wasn't just a place, it was a trap. In his log, he describes the sensory cue of the car's engine sputtering, the electrical system overwhelmed by the site's magnetic field. He abandoned the vehicle and began to run through the grass. The pulse was everywhere. It was in his chest, in his brain, and in the ground beneath his feet. He felt a sense of quiet dread that he would never leave the coordinates, that he would simply be refiled into the Oakhaven system as resident 14,205. His last entry is written in a cramped, desperate hand. He mentions seeing a fleet of unmarked white buses appearing on the horizon, the erasure teams sent to clean up the anomaly. He knew his time was over. He buried his field log in a waterproof canister beneath a specific marker, a rusted fence post at the edge of the blue sky. He hoped that one day an archivist would find it and realize that the wind in Nebraska wasn't just wind. He wrote his final sentence about the pulse, and then the log ends. The next 10 pages are blank, the paper pristine and untouched, as if the person who was supposed to write on them had simply ceased to exist. The archival records show that Thomas Thorne was retired on November 14, 1968. There is no pension record, no photograph, and no death certificate. Like the residents of Oakhaven, he became a face without a number, a ghost signal in the government's machine. The field log was found 30 years later by a maintenance crew, hidden exactly where he said it would be. But the marker was gone, and the tall grass had reclaimed the site. When the researchers tried to return to the coordinates to verify his findings, they found nothing but the wind. But as they stood there in the silence, one of them noticed a familiar pattern. They checked their watches. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 2, exhale. The pulse was still there. Thomas Thorne's log is a window into a world where the earth itself has been turned into a machine. We have seen the pulse, and we have felt the breath of a hidden city. But Thorne's journals contained one final, cryptic note that we have yet to explore. In the margins of his entry about the subterranean park, he drew a small, crude map of a specific location within the city of Alt labeled Box 19. He wrote that the pulse didn't originate from the fans or the bellows. It originated from Box 19, and according to his notes, Box 19 didn't contain machinery. It contained paper. Thousands of birth certificates for children who had not yet been born. Each one already signed by a parent who had been dead for 20 years. The wind has a pulse, and the pulse has a name. To find it, we must leave the tall grass and enter the most restricted section of the Oakhaven archive. We must look at the documents that prove the government isn't just hiding people, they are manufacturing them. The next file is titled Box 19, the birth certificates printed in secret, and it reveals the true purpose of the Null-Set protocol. The logs are closed, but the machinery is still running. And as we move to the next file, you might want to check your own pulse and see if it matches the rhythm of the wind. There is a room in the Federal Record Center in Suitland, Maryland, that does not appear on the facility's master blueprints. It is a high-security environmental vault, shielded by 3 feet of lid-reinforced concrete. Inside this room sits a single, nondescript wooden crate labeled simply Box 19, while the rest of the National Archives is a record of what has passed. Box 19 is a classified record of what was planned. Inside, researchers found a series of birth certificates for 14,200 for individuals. The anomaly, however, is not the names, but the dates. These certificates were printed, embossed, and signed in 1968, yet they document births that were scheduled to occur as far into the future as 1995. This is an encrypted reality, a hidden truth that suggests the government wasn't just recording its citizens, it was pre-authorizing them. Every file in Box 19 is a masterclass in bureaucratic erased history. It reveals a modern paradox where the legal identity precedes the biological person. The certificates are not forgeries. They are genuine, government-issued documents on official bond paper, watermarked with the Great Seal of the United States. They are the pre-birth blueprints for the residents of Oakhaven, an anomaly that proves the existence of a static archive of lives that were engineered before they were born. The discovery of these files has been systematically suppressed for decades, hidden behind layers of national security protocols. The file was stamped "Never Open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this space is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that seems to settle in the marrow of your bones. The air is artificially chilled, kept at a constant temperature to prevent the yellowing of the secret ledger. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets, leaving only the ghostly impressions of names that haven't yet been called. There is a faint scent of cedar and sterile ozone, a smell of a future that was decided in a dark room half a century ago. As the fluorescent lights overhead flicker with a subtle, electric buzz, we peel back the lid of Box 19 and step into the machinery of pre-destination. To understand the weight of Box 19, one must appreciate the sheer clinical perfection of its contents. When the crate was first opened by an unauthorized audit team in late 2024, they expected to find discarded tax records or land deeds. Instead, they found 14,204 folders, each one color-coded to match a specific demographic profile. The paper is heavy, a 24-pound cotton fiber bond that feels unnervingly substantial in your hands. It is the kind of paper used for the most sacred of American documents, treaties, presidential proclamations, and now, the birth certificates of ghosts. Every certificate is crisp, as if the air inside the box has been frozen in time since the moment the lid was nailed shut in 1968. As you run your fingers over the embossed seals, you notice a sensory cue. The paper has a slight, metallic vibration. A chemical analysis performed by the collective suggests that the paper was treated with a microscopic iron oxide coating, a magnetic layer designed to make the documents readable by the early UNIVAC mainframes. This was a smart archive decades before the digital age. The government was preparing a ledger that could be scanned, verified, and updated by machines without the need for human intervention. The intellectual curiosity of the researcher is immediately piqued. Why would a government in the 1960s need to automate the identities of people who wouldn't exist for another 30 years? The certificates themselves are a study in bureaucratic coldness. The font is a standard mid-century serif, clean and authoritative, but the details in the fields are where the dread begins to manifest. The father's name and mother's name are often listed as assigned participant 1 and assigned participant 2, followed by a 7-digit serial number. These were not children born of love or chance. They were the biological assets of the Oakhaven project. They were the second and third generations of the Null-Set protocol, born into a world of concrete and fluorescent light. Their lives mapped out before their first breath was ever taken. The monitor flicker of the archive lamp reveals the signature at the bottom of each document. It is the signature of the Registrar of Records for the District of Columbia. However, the ink analysis shows that the signatures were applied using an autopan, a mechanical device that replicates a human signature with terrifying accuracy. There is no variation in the pressure, no hesitation in the stroke. It is the hand of the government, moving with the precision of a clock, signing away the freedom of 14,204 unborn souls. This is the ultimate static archive, a world where the future is already a matter of historical record, and where the line between a citizen and a data point has been completely erased. In the analytical framework of the archive chill, We must confront the temporal paradox of Box 19. How can a document exist for a person who has not yet been born? In the American legal system, a birth certificate is a live record. It is created at the moment of birth as a verification of a biological event. To preprint these documents is to reverse the flow of causality. It suggests that in the eyes of the government, the legal fiction is more important than the biological reality. If the paper exists, the person exists. The body is merely a secondary requirement, a vessel to fulfill the obligations of the ledger. The dates on the certificates in Box 19 are organized with a chilling mathematical symmetry. There is a cluster of births scheduled for May 1975, another for August 1982, and a final, massive wave in 1990. These dates correspond exactly with the projected expansion phases of the Oakhaven underground facility. The government was planning the population density of its secret city with the same precision a farmer uses to plan a crop. They weren't just predicting population growth, they were dictating it. They were ensuring that at any given moment, the city of tall grass would have exactly 14,204 residents, no more, and no less. This leads us to a moment of quiet dread. If the population was fixed at 14,204, then for every pre-birth certificate in Box 19, there must have been a corresponding pre-death certificate. The archive is a closed loop. For a new asset to enter the system, an old asset must be retired. While the certificates of death have not yet been found, the researchers noticed that the back of each birth certificate contains a faint, encrypted watermark that can only be seen under ultraviolet light. When scanned, these watermarks reveal a projected expiration date. The government had already decided when each of these 14,204 individuals would cease to be useful. Their entire existence, from the first pulse of their heartbeat to the final flicker of their brain activity, was a managed resource. The sensory cue of the cold air in the vault becomes almost unbearable when you realize the implications of this temporal management. We are looking at a master schedule of humanity. The Tier 1 audience, with their deep understanding of modern systems and surveillance, will recognize this as the precursor to the predictive algorithms that govern our lives today. But in 1968, this wasn't an algorithm, it was a physical stack of paper in a wooden box. It was a manual attempt to override the randomness of life. The 14,204 were the first humans to be fully integrated into a managed reality, where even their birth was a classified secret and their identity was a pre-recorded transmission. As we delve deeper into the folders of Box 19, we find a series of medical projections attached to each certificate. These are not standard health records, they are genetic blueprints. In 1968, the science of DNA was in its infancy, yet the Oakhaven project seemed to possess a level of genetic understanding that wouldn't be public for decades. The files contain detailed charts of hereditary traits, eye color, height, bone density, and even behavioral predispositions. The government was selecting the traits of the 14,204 residents before they were even conceived. They were building a super archive of human traits, a biological inventory designed to survive a nuclear winter or a societal collapse. There is a faint metallic static that emanates from these medical charts. It is a sensory reminder that these documents were handled by the elite scientists of the Cold War, men who operated in the shadows of the Manhattan Project and the early aerospace programs. They viewed the human body as a biological machine that could be optimized for the subterranean environment of Oakhaven. The records mention the use of synthetic nutritional protocols and low-light adaptation for the unborn generations. The children of the 90s, as planned in 1968, were intended to be a different kind of humana species, specifically evolved to live beneath the ledger, in the quiet, climate-controlled halls of the underground city. The intellectual curiosity of the researcher is drawn to a specific folder labeled the Thorn link. Inside, there is a birth certificate for a child named Thomas Thorn Jr., scheduled for birth in 1988. This is the child of Agent Thomas Thorn, the man who was erased from the record for investigating the site. The government hadn't just erased Thorn, they had archived his lineage. They had taken his genetic material and incorporated it into the Oakhaven population, ensuring that his bloodline would continue to serve the very machine he tried to expose. This is the ultimate form of bureaucratic revenge, to turn the rebel into a permanent resident of the archive. The dread in the room grows as you realize that the ink used on these genetic charts is a deep, iridescent purple color that doesn't exist in standard government stationery. It is a living ink, a chemical compound that reacts to the touch of human skin. When a researcher's thumb pressed against the corner of the page, the ink glowed for a fraction of a second, as if it was recognizing a biological presence. The archive isn't just a record of the past. It is a reactive environment. Box 19 is alive. It is a biological ledger that continues to monitor the assets it created, even 60 years later. The 14,204 are not just names on a page. They are the living components of a secret American history. From a documentary perspective, the most terrifying aspect of Box 19 is the declaration of non-entity found at the bottom of the crate. This is a legal document, signed by the Attorney General in 1967, that provides the Oakhaven residents with a unique legal status. It states that the 14,204 individuals, though biologically human, are to be classified as federally owned intellectual property. This meant that they had no constitutional rights, no ownership of their own names, and no legal standing in any civilian court. They were the first corporate citizens, owned entirely by the archive that birthed them. This legal fiction allowed the government to perform experiments on the Oak population that would be strictly forbidden in the real world. The pre-birth certificates were the titles of ownership. By registering them before they were born, the government claimed them before they could ever be claimed by their parents or by the state. It was a preemptive strike against human freedom. The residents of the city of Tallgrass were born into a state of legal non-existence, a paradox that allowed them to be both active participants in the economy and invisible ghosts in the eyes of the law. They were the ultimate paper citizens, the foundation of a hidden society that operates beneath the radar of the American democracy. As we reflect on this, the sensory cue of the monitor flicker takes on a new meaning. It is the pulse of a system that views us all as data points. The Oakhaven project was simply the most extreme manifestation of this philosophy. The Tier 1 audience will understand the quiet dread of the Social Security dead drop. If you are owned by the archive, your life is not your own. Your choices are pre-recorded, your health is a managed resource, and your death is a scheduled event. The certificates in Box 19 are the physical proof that this system was successfully implemented in the heart of the United States, and that it has been operating in silence for over half a century. The coldness of the vault is not just a temperature, it is a state of being. The researchers who found Box 19 reported a feeling of intellectual vertigo, the sensation that the world they knew was just a thin veneer over a much more structured and terrifying reality. The paper town of Oakhaven wasn't a mistake or a decoy, it was a prototype. It was a first attempt to build a world that was entirely defined by the archive. And as we look at the names on the certificates, names like Grace Miller and John Vance, we realize that these people are likely still alive today, moving through our cities, working in our offices, and living out the lives that were printed for them in 1968. That the story of Box 19 does not end with its discovery. In early 2025, during a routine system upgrade at the National Archives, the digital records of Box 19 began to migrate, without any human input. The data from the 14,204 birth certificates was uploaded into the cloud, where it began to integrate with modern biometric databases. The ghosts of 1968 were suddenly appearing in 21st century facial recognition systems. The fractals and geometric patterns mentioned in the previous file were being recognized by AI as valid human faces. The archive was finally coming online. The sensory cue of a faint static charge in the air is a common report among technicians who work near these specific server clusters. They describe a hollow feeling in the data, as if they are looking at a space where a person should be, but isn't. The 14,204 are no longer just paper and ink. They are a distributed intelligence, a set of identities that can be inhabited by anyone or no one. They are the empty containers of the digital age. A set of high-clearance personas that the government can use to perform operations in the clear view of the public without ever being identified. They are the perfect camouflage. As we conclude this clinical audit of Box 19, we are left with a sense of quiet dread. The box is now empty, its contents moved to an even more restricted facility, but the names remain. They are etched into the memory of the UNIVAC, the magnetic tapes of the 70s, the hard drives of the 90s, and the cloud of today. They are a permanent fixture of the American ledger. The birth certificates of the unborn have become the identities of the immortal. The government's secret is no longer a stack of paper. It is the very air we breathe in the digital world. We look back at the wooden crate, now just a hollow shell in a dark room. The smell of cedar has faded, replaced by the sterile scent of computer cooling systems. The static archive has evolved. It has left the basement and entered the network. And as we close this file, we realize that the 14,204 are not just a historical anomaly. They are a prophecy. They are the blueprint for a future where every birth is a classified event, and every life is a managed asset of the state. The secret of Box 19 is that the box was never meant to keep the records in, it was meant to keep us out. The birth certificates of Box 19 provide the visual proof that Oakhaven was not just a city, but a generational project. We have seen the names, the dates, and the genetic blueprints of a population that exists outside of time, but there is one question that the certificates cannot answer. What was the legal authority that allowed this to happen? How could a democracy authorize the creation of a static archive of its own citizens? The answer lies in a document so secret that even its title was erased from the executive registries for 30 years. It is a directive issued in 1962, during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a moment when the world stood on the brink of annihilation. It is known as the Paper Town Directive, and it gave the government the power to create shadow jurisdictions, places that exist only in the law, but have total authority over the physical world. The certificates were the people, the directive was the law, and as we open the next file, we will see the signed order that turned the United States into a collection of invisible borders. The next chapter of the archive is titled The 1962 Paper Town Directive, A Law for the Void. The ink is still wet on the signature that erased your geography. We are turning the page now. Stay in the chill. In the spring of 1962, a document was signed in the deepest bunker of the West Wing that fundamentally altered the definition of American sovereignty. It was not a treaty, nor was it a public law. It was a classified executive directive that authorized the government to legally lie to the earth itself. This was the birth of the Paper Town Protocol, a hidden truth designed to protect the nation's most sensitive assets by creating an anomaly in the geographic record. The protocol allowed for the creation of entire municipalities that existed on every federal map, within every tax ledger, and inside every encrypted census file, yet occupied no physical space on the surface of the planet. These were trap cities, geographic decoys used to facilitate black budget laundering and to hide the movement of thousands of erased individuals who were no longer permitted to exist in the real world. For decades, the existence of these non-places was dismissed as an urban legend or a cartographic error, but the archive has recovered the original authorization files, documents that prove the government's mastery over the void. The protocol reveals a modern paradox. If a town is recognized by the IRS, the Social Security Administration, and the Department of Defense, does it matter if the ground it sits on is empty? This is the ultimate architecture of the unseen, a secret history written in the margins of our maps. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this space is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that seems to settle in the marrow of your bones. The air is artificially chilled, kept at a constant temperature to prevent the degradation of the delicate magnetic tapes. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets, leaving only the ghostly impressions of names and coordinates that shouldn't exist. There is a faint scent of ozone and old paper, a smell of industrial secrets and forgotten science. As a faint monitor flicker illuminates the dust motes dancing in the sterile air, we step back into the crisis of 1962. Where the map of the world was first torn open to hide a secret. To understand the necessity of the Paper Town Protocol, one must look at the climate of 1962. The world was suspended in a state of terminal tension. The Cuban Missile Crisis had exposed a terrifying vulnerability in the American infrastructure. We were too easy to map. Soviet satellites and high-altitude reconnaissance were beginning to strip away the privacy of the American landscape. The Department of Defense realized that they could no longer hide secret installations simply by building them in the desert. They had to hide them in plain sight. They had to create a geographic static, a series of false data points that would overwhelm enemy intelligence. The protocol was framed as a Cold War necessity. The logic was cold and analytical. If the enemy is looking for a secret base, they will look for the gaps on the map. But if the map is filled with fake towns, fake populations, and fake infrastructure, the gaps disappear. Oakhaven was the prototype for this theory. By creating a fully documented city in Nebraska, the government created a legal anchor for its subterranean activities. The 14,200 for residents weren't just a population, they were a protective layer of data. They were the human shields of the information age. People whose very existence on paper served to mask the high scientific and military research happening beneath the soil. The sensory cue of the cold air in the archive reflects the CLINICAL detachment of the men who designed this protocol. They didn't view the creation of a fake town as a moral or legal issue. To them, it was an engineering problem. They utilized the newly installed UNIVAC mainframes to generate the noise of a functioning city. They programmed the machine to simulate traffic patterns, utility usage, and even local weather anomalies for Oakhaven. They were building a world within a world, a managed reality that was designed to be indistinguishable from the truth to any outside observer. The intellectual curiosity of the time was focused on information superiority, the idea that the government who controlled the ledger controlled the reality of the nation. But the protocol had a secondary, more secretive purpose: black budget laundering. In 1962, the cost of the Cold War was spiraling out of control. Programs involving advanced aerospace, nuclear propulsion, and psychological warfare required billions of dollars that could not be tracked by Congress. The paper town provided the perfect solution. Since the town officially existed, it could be the recipient of federal grants, infrastructure loans, and social programs. Millions of dollars were sent to Oakhaven for roads that were never paved and schools that were never built. The money would enter the town's ledger and then vanish into the void, re-emerging as untraceable funding for the nation's darkest projects. Oakhaven was a financial ghost, a machine for turning public taxes into private secrets. How does one legally erase a piece of the earth? The mechanics of the paper town protocol relied on a concept known as trap streets. In the world of commercial cartography, mapmakers would often include a tiny, non-existent street in their maps. If a competitor copied their map, the trap street would prove the copyright infringement. The government took this concept and scaled it to a terrifying degree. They didn't just create trap streets, they created trap jurisdictions. These were areas where the federal government exercised a unique form of sovereign anomaly, a legal status that allowed them to override the geographic reality of the state. 1962 directive established that if a location was designated as a national archive zone, its physical characteristics were classified. This meant that the state of Nebraska had no legal right to survey the land at the Oakhaven coordinates. The map of Nebraska was effectively cut open, and a piece of federal paper was stitched into the gap. Every 100 words or so in the technical manuals for this protocol, you find a mention of data integrity. The government was obsessed with making sure the lie was consistent across every department. If the Department of Transportation showed a road leading to Oakhaven, the post office had to have a delivery route for it, and the Census Bureau had to have residents living on it. The sensory experience of reading these technical manuals is one of quiet dread. The level of detail is suffocating. There are instructions on how to fabricate local history, creating fake newspaper archives for the Oakhaven Sentinel, and drafting fake town council minutes. They even created historical markers for the site, which were placed in the tall grass to confuse any hikers or hunters who might stumble into the area. The monitor flicker of the archive screen highlights the cold, calculated nature of this deception. They weren't just lying about the present, they were lying about the past. They were creating a fake heritage for a fake people, ensuring that Oakhaven had roots in the American soil, even if those roots were made of plastic and magnetic tape. This archive of the unseen was managed by a specialized group within the Treasury Department, known as the Auditors of the Void. These were men and women whose entire careers were dedicated to maintaining the consistency of the paper towns. They worked in windowless rooms in Washington, moving millions of dollars through the accounts of people who didn't exist, and filing reports on the economic growth of a city that was actually a subterranean bunker. For the Tier 1 audience, this is the most disturbing part of the protocol, the realization that a significant portion of the American bureaucracy is dedicated to the maintenance of a fiction. The ledger is not a reflection of reality, it is a replacement for it. As we move into the late 1960s, the Papertown protocol evolved from a paper-based system into a digital one. The introduction of the UNIVAC mainframe changed everything. The machine didn't just record the lie, it lived it. The auditors discovered that they could use the computer to breathe life into the Oakhaven data. They created a social simulation program that ran 24 hours a day. The UNIVAC would generate events in the town: a local election, a high school football game, a rise in the price of milk at the local grocery store. These events were then fed into the national data stream as if they were real occurrences. The sensory cue of a faint static charge in the server room is a reminder of the power these machines held. The UNIVAC was the first reality generator. It ensured that Oakhaven was always in sync with the rest of the country. If there was an economic recession in the Midwest, the UNIVAC would adjust the Oakhaven files to show a corresponding dip in local commerce. If there was a flu outbreak in Nebraska, the residents of Oakhaven would show up in the medical registries as having been vaccinated. The machine was so effective that it began to fool other machines. Other government computers would interact with the Oakhaven data, sending automated queries and receiving automated responses, creating a massive, self-sustaining loop of digital fiction. The quiet dread of the digital lie is the fact that it leaves no room for human error. In the old paper-based archive, a tired clerk might make a mistake and reveal the secret, but the UNIVAC was tireless and flawless. It maintained the null-set with a clinical precision that no human could match. This leads us to a reflection on the nature of truth in the computer age. If every system in the world agrees that a town exists, and every machine validates its data, does the physical absence of the town even matter? The Paper Town Protocol proved that in a sufficiently advanced society, the data body of a city is more important than its physical body. This created an intellectual curiosity among the Oakhaven architects. They began to wonder if they could use the protocol to hide more than just money and military bases. They began to experiment with identity archiving, taking real people who had become inconvenient to the state and moving them into the Oakhaven ledger. These individuals would be unbirthed from their original lives and rebirthed as residents of the paper town. They would continue to live, work, and pay taxes, but they would do so within the protected confines of the protocol. They were the first citizens of the static archive, people whose lives were hidden behind a wall of high-frequency data and cartographic deception. The 1962 directive has never been officially rescinded, while the Oakhaven site in Nebraska was decommissioned in the early 70s. The Paper Town Protocol itself remains an active part of the American security architecture. The archive contains hints of other null-set locations across the United States, patches of tall grass in Nevada, empty forests in Virginia, and uncharted islands off the coast of Maine. Each one is a pocket of sovereign anomaly, a place where the map has been erased to accommodate a hidden truth. These are the modern ghost jurisdictions, sites that continue to facilitate the movement of black budget funds and the storage of classified assets in the 21st century. The sensory detail of the monitor flicker in the archive today is a reminder that we are still living with the consequences of 1962. Every time you see a blurred image on a digital map, or an area marked as data una by lovely, you are looking at the remnants of the Paper Town Protocol. The government has transitioned from hiding cities to hiding nodes. In the digital age, you don't need a town of 14,000 people to hide a secret. You only need a server farm and a legal anomaly. The 14,204 residents of Oakhaven were the pioneers of this distributed secrecy, a population whose lives were sacrificed to build the first layer of the invisible world. There is a sense of reflection in the realization that our geography is a managed resource. We trust our GPS to tell us where we are, but we forget that the GPS signal is a government transmission. The satellites are programmed to respect the null-set zones, providing us with a version of the world that has been scrubbed of its most sensitive truths. We are all living on a map that has been corrected by the archive. The Paper Town Protocol is not just a Cold War relic. It is the operating system of the modern world. It is the law that allows the void to exist in the middle of our lives. The final, quiet dread of the 1962 directive is the citizen provision. Hidden deep within the encrypted files is a clause that allows the government to apply the Paper Town status to an individual without their knowledge. This is the internal exile protocol. A person could wake up one day and find that their home address is no longer recognized by the system. Their social security number has been moved to a null-set block, and their entire history has been archived. They would become a resident of a paper town while still standing in their own living room. They would be erased from the world while still breathing its air. This is the ultimate power of the protocol, the ability to turn a human being into a geographic anomaly. As we look at the financial ledgers recovered from the Oakhaven audit, we see the true scale of the Cold War necessity. In the year 1968 alone, over $400 million was moved through the Oakhaven Municipal Banking Institution that consisted of a single desk in a secure room in Langley, Virginia. This money was used to fund the quiet wars of the era, the coups, the assassinations, and the secret technological leaps that defined the late 20th century. The paper town was the ultimate laundry, a place where the dirty money of the state could be washed clean by the fiction of a Midwestern town. The sensory cue of the cold, stagnant air in the archive cabinet is a physical manifestation of this frozen history. This money didn't just disappear. It was invested in the future of the archive. It funded the research into the very digital systems we use today. The internet, the cloud, and the global surveillance network were all birthed with the ghost dollars of Oak. The secret city in Nebraska was the mother of the modern surveillance state. It was the place where the government learned how to manage a population without ever having to look them in the face. The 14,204 residents were the beta testers for the world. We now inhabit the intellectual curiosity of the researcher must eventually turn to the question of accountability. Who audits the auditors of the void? The records show that every 10 years, the paper town would undergo a self-audit. A team of high-clearance officials would visit the coordinates, stand in the tall grass for an hour, and then sign a document stating that the town was in full compliance with federal regulations. It was a ritual of deception, a bureaucratic performance designed to maintain the integrity of the lie. They would look at the windswept prairie and see a thriving city, because the law commanded them to see it. This leads us to a profound reflection on the nature of belief. If enough people in positions of power agree to believe in a lie, does that lie become the truth? The Paper Town Protocol suggests that truth is not a matter of physical reality, but a matter of institutional consensus. If the archive says the city is there, the city is there. If the archive says the 14,204 residents are alive, they are alive. We are all subservient to the consensus of the archive. We are all living in a world where the paper is more real than the ground, and the ledger is more powerful than the life it records. In the early 21st century, the Paper Town Protocol faced its first major challenge, the democratization of satellite imagery. For the first time, ordinary citizens could look at the coordinates of Oakhaven through tools like Google Earth. They expected to see a city. They saw nothing but grass. This created a wave of cartographic dissonance that the government had to manage. The response was a massive, digital update to the protocol. The null-set zones were now protected by imagery masking, algorithms that automatically replaced sensitive sites with generic textures of forest or field. The sensory detail of a faint, high-pitched hum in the archive room today is the sound of these algorithms at work. They are the digital descendants of the 1962 directive. They are the new architects of the void, working in real time to ensure that our maps remain safe. But the masks are not perfect. Sometimes, the algorithm glitches. A sharp-eyed researcher might notice a shadow in a field that doesn't match any tree, or a blur in a forest that follows the unmistakable grid of a city street. These are the ghost pixels of the Paper Town protocols, the digital leaks that prove the secret is still there. Hidden beneath the layer of managed imagery, the quiet dread of the modern era, is the realization that we can no longer trust our own eyes, even when we are looking at a raw feed. The archive has integrated itself into our very perception of the world. We are looking at a processed reality, a world that has been filtered through the priorities of the 1962 directive. The Paper Town has expanded to encompass the entire digital landscape. We are all residents of Oakhaven now, living in a space that is defined by what the government chooses to show us and what it chooses to hide. The tall grass is no longer in Nebraska. It is in the code of our screens. As we conclude this clinical audit of the Paper Town Protocol, we are left with a final, unsettling reflection. The 1962 directive was created to protect the nation from an external enemy, but in doing so, it created an internal void, a space where the government can operate without oversight, without law, and without reality. The Oakhaven experiment proved that a democracy can sustain itself on a diet of lies, as long as the lies are documented with enough precision. The archive is not just a place where we store our history, it is the place where we manufacture our truth. And the truth is, the town of 14,204 people is still there. You just have to know how to read the paper. The Paper Town Protocol provided the legal and financial framework for Oakhaven. We have seen how the government used the logic of the void to hide its darkest secrets. But while the protocol dealt with the place, it didn't address the space. How do you design a city that doesn't exist? How do you build a subterranean vault that can house 14,000 people for generations without ever being detected by a seismic sensor or a thermal camera? The answer lies in the architecture. Hidden within the 1962 files is a set of blueprints for a structure that defies every law of traditional civil engineering. It is a design for a liminal city, a place built out of non-reflective materials, sound dampening, and a recursive infrastructure that allows it to vanish into the Earth's own magnetic field. The protocol was the law, the architecture was the reality, and as we open the next file, we will look at the drawings that were once considered the holy grail of secret science. The next chapter of the archive is titled Project Null-Set, the architecture of the unseen. We are moving from the paper into the stone. The blueprints are unfolding now. Stay in the chill. In the classified vaults of the Department of the Interior, buried beneath 3 layers of administrative static, lies a set of architectural blueprints that defy the laws of traditional civil engineering. These are the master plans for Project Null-Set, an operation so deeply encrypted that its very name was erased from the Federal Registry for over 50 years. The blueprints do not describe a bridge, a dam, or a skyscraper. Instead, they detail a sprawling, subterranean municipality designed to house 14,200 for people within a geographic anomaly, a city built of materials and recursive geometries that allow it to remain invisible to any civilian or military sensor. This is the hidden truth behind the Oakhaven mystery. The government didn't just find a void in the map, they manufactured one. The project was the ultimate architectural paradox, a high-density urban environment that leaves no footprint, casts no shadow, and emits no heat. It was an anomaly of design, a secret city intended to serve as a static archive for the American elite in the event of a total systemic collapse. Every detail of the construction was a classified secret, from the carbon-lead composite of the walls to the artificial suns that provided a managed reality for the residents below. This was the architecture of the unseen, a blueprint for a world that exists only in the gaps of our perception. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this space is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that seems to settle in the marrow of your bones. The air is artificially chilled, kept at a constant 58 degrees to preserve the integrity of the original blueprints. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets, leaving only the ghostly impressions of lines that define a reality we were never meant to see. There is a faint scent of old vellum, an industrial ozone, a smell of progress hidden in the dark. As a faint monitor flicker illuminates the dust motes dancing in the sterile air, we unroll the plans for Project Null-Set and step into the stone dot to understand the architecture of Oakhaven. One must first confront the scale of its invisibility. The blueprints reveal a city organized into a perfect, concentric grid, buried 300 feet beneath a Nebraska prairie. This wasn't a crude bunker or a series of tunnels. It was a masterpiece of recursive infrastructure. Every street, every building, and every utility line was designed to mirror the town of a typical 1950s American suburb, but with a clinical, subterranean twist. The sky was a vast, curved dome of reinforced concrete, fitted with millions of microscopic fiber optic points that simulated the movement of the stars and the progression of the sun. The sensory detail of the blueprints is suffocating. The architects utilized a material known in the files as vantestone, a carbon-lead composite that absorbs 99% of all electromagnetic radiation. This material ensured that the city would never appear on a ground-penetrating radar scan. Even if a Soviet satellite passed directly over the coordinates, it would see nothing but the natural resonance of the Earth. The city was a black hole of data, a space where information went to die. This was the core of Project Null-Set, the creation of a location that was physically present but digitally absent. The 14,200 for residents lived in a world that was literally invisible to the rest of humanity. In the center of the grid stood the administration spire, a structure that served as the brain of the city. It didn't house government offices in the traditional sense. It housed the local UNIVAC uplink. The architecture was built around the machine. The spire was a massive heatsink designed to channel the immense thermal output of the mainframe into the surrounding bedrock, where it was dispersed through a network of liquid nitrogen cooling pipes. Every 100 words or so in the technical specifications, you find a reminder of the static mandate. The city must remain at a constant internal temperature of 72 degrees. Regardless of the season on the surface. This thermal stability was a requirement for the managed reality of the residents. The quiet dread of the architecture lies in its permanence. The blueprints show that Oakhaven was built to last for 500 years without external maintenance. The water was recycled through a closed-loop filtration system that utilized volcanic minerals. The air was scrubbed of carbon dioxide by giant, subterranean greenhouses filled with genetically modified moss. It was a self-sustaining organism, a stone lung breathing beneath the tall grass. The residents were not just living in a city, they were living inside a machine that was designed to outlast the civilization that created it. They were the inhabitants of a static archive, preserved in a state of architectural perfection while the world above moved toward chaos. As we analyze the residential sectors of the Null-Set blueprints, we see the true clinical nature of the operation. Each house in Oakhaven was a perfect replica of a Midwestern colonial or ranch-style home, but they were built entirely of non-porous synthetics. There was no wood, no brick, and no natural stone. Everything was a cast-molded imitation. designed to prevent the growth of mold or the degradation of materials in the high-humidity underground environment. The sensory cue of the perfect surfaces is a recurring theme in the logs. Residents reported that the walls felt hollow and the floors never creaked. It was a liminal space, a world of beautiful, artificial surfaces that felt disconnected from the passage of time. The windows of these homes were actually high-resolution display screens, linked to the atmospheric pulse system on the surface. They showed a live feed of the Nebraska sky, but it was a filtered version, always clear, always sunny, always perfect. The architects realized that the human psyche cannot survive in a state of total darkness, so they created an optical archive of the surface. They gave the residents a sky they could trust, even if it was just a projection on a concrete wall. This was the managed reality of Project Null-Set, a world where the weather was a policy decision and the horizon was an encrypted file. Intellectual curiosity of the researcher must eventually turn to the liminal corridors. Between the residential blocks were vast, empty transit zones, areas of perfectly polished white concrete where no one was permitted to linger. These zones were designed to minimize acoustic resonance, ensuring that the sound of 14,204 people living their lives would not create a collective vibration that could be detected by seismic sensors. The city was a silent zone where even the sound of a footstep was absorbed by the architecture. The residents lived in a state of perpetual quiet, a muffled existence that mirrored the silence of the archive itself. There is a sense of reflection in the realization that the architecture was a form of psychological conditioning. By living in a world of artificial suns and concrete skies, the residents were being trained to accept the ledger as their primary reality. They weren't citizens of Nebraska. They were citizens of the Null. Their environment was a constant reminder that they were special, preserved, and saved from the entropy of the real world. But the cost of this preservation was the loss of their connection to the earth. They were living in a museum of themselves, an architectural cage designed to keep the ideal American citizen in a state of permanent, unchanging grace. The most brilliant and most unsettling aspect of Project Null-Set was the interface between the subterranean city and the surface. As we have seen in previous files, the tall grass of the Nebraska prairie was not merely a cosmetic cover, it was a sophisticated thermal disguise. The blueprints detail a series of exhaust vanes, microscopic vents hidden within the hollow stalks of the engineered big bluestem grass. These vanes were designed to release the city's waste heat in a diffuse pattern, mimicking the natural evaporation of moisture from the soil. This ensured that no infrared sensor could detect a concentrated heat signature at the coordinates. The sensory detail of this atmospheric bleed is documented in the engineering logs of 1965. The air being expelled from the city was filtered through a series of odor scrubbers to ensure that the scent of 14,000 people, their cooking, their waste, their very breath did not reach the surface. To a person standing in the tall grass, the air would smell of nothing but wind and ozone. The city was scentless, a bureaucratic void that left no olfactory trace. This was the architecture of the unseen at its most fundamental level, the total suppression of the human presence in the physical world. Blueprints showed that the entire 3-mile radius of the Oakhaven site was effectively a radiant floor. The heat from the subterranean reactors was used to keep the topsoil at a constant temperature, preventing the formation of frost in the winter and ensuring that the tall grass remained green and lush long after the surrounding prairie had turned brown. This created a perpetual summer at the coordinates, a subtle anomaly that could only be noticed by someone who was looking for it. For the Tier 1 audience, this is the hallmark of a high-level cover-up, the use of life itself as a camouflage for the machine. The quiet dread of the thermal disguise is the realization that the nature Thorne saw was actually a biological machine. The grass was a lung, the soil was a heat sink, and the wind was an exhaust system. Project Null-Set had consumed the landscape and replaced it with a simulation. The architecture of the city didn't stop at the concrete ceiling. It extended into every blade of grass and every grain of dust on the surface. The government hadn't just built a city in the void. They had turned the void into a living, breathing extension of the archive. They had archived the earth itself. At the absolute center of the Oakhaven blueprints lies the core sector. This was the power source for the entire Null-Set operation, a compact, liquid-salt nuclear reactor that operated in total silence. Unlike traditional reactors, which require massive cooling towers and constant external maintenance, the Oakhaven core was designed to be self-contained. It utilized the natural pressure of the deep earth to maintain its stability, and it generated enough electricity to power a city twice the size of Oakhaven for a century. This was the infinite engine of the archive, the heartbeat that drove the pulse of the wind. The technical specs for the reactor are a masterclass in Cold War paranoia. The core was encased in a detonation shield, a series of charges designed to collapse the entire sector and seal it in a glass-like tomb. If the city's security was ever compromised, this was the scorched earth policy of the architecture. If the secret of Oakhaven was ever discovered by the public, the city would be erased not just from the ledger, but from the physical world. The 14,204 residents were living on top of a doomsday clock, a permanent reminder that their existence was conditional upon their invisibility. The sensory cue of a faint, high-frequency hum in the core sector is documented in the rare maintenance tapes recovered from the site. The technicians who worked near the reactor reported a sensation of internal static, a feeling that their own atoms were being synchronized with the frequency of the power grid. They were the keepers of the heartbeat, the men who ensured that the artificial suns never flickered and the artificial wind never stopped blowing. But the cost of this power was a constant low-level radiation that saturated the architecture. The Vanterstone walls were designed to absorb this radiation, but over time, the stone itself became alive with the energy of the void. The intellectual curiosity of the researcher is drawn to the energy redistribution maps. The blueprints show that the vast majority of the reactor's power was not used for the city's residents. Instead, it was funneled into a series of data transmitters that were buried in the bedrock surrounding the city. These transmitters were the sources of the ghost signals that Thorne detected. They were designed to broadcast the data body of Oakhaven into the national grid, ensuring that the city remained active in the eyes of the government's machines. The city was a power plant for a lie, a subterranean engine that generated the electricity needed to keep 14,204 ghosts alive in the American ledger. As we reflect on the residential sectors of the Null-Set, we find a disturbing architectural feature known as the absence of entropy. In the real world, things decay, paint peels, wood rots, and dust accumulates. But the blueprints for Oakhaven describe a self-cleaning environment. The air filtration system was so efficient that it removed 99.9% of all particulate matter, including human skin cells and lint. The materials used in the construction were chemically treated to repel dust and stains. The result was a city that remained in a state of pristine suspension. The sensory experience of living in such a world is one of quiet dread. The residents reported that they felt like they were living inside a photograph. Nothing ever changed. The light was always the same intensity, the air was always the same temperature, and the surfaces were always perfectly clean. There was no season in Oakhaven, only the static now. This was the ultimate architectural goal of Project Null-Set, to eliminate the passage of time. If nothing decays, then nothing has passed. The archive is a place where history stops, and the residents were the victims of this temporal freeze. The blueprints show that the city had no cemeteries. There was no provision for death in the architecture of the scene. If a resident died, they were processed in the deregistration facility, a high-heat incinerator that reduced the biological asset to a fine, sterile ash, which was then incorporated into the concrete used for minor repairs. The residents were literally built back into the city. They became the walls, the floors, and the ceilings of their own archive. This is the final, clinical truth of the Null-Set. You do not leave the city. You simply become a part of its structure. The intellectual curiosity turns toward the social planning rooms. These were spaces in the spire where the architects monitored the movements of the 14,204 residents. The architecture was designed to encourage managed interaction. The streets were laid out to ensure that residents encountered each other at specific times and in specific places. The city was a social laboratory, and the buildings were the test tubes. The architecture wasn't just housing. It was a form of behavior modification. It was a machine for producing the perfect citizen, a person who was as static and predictable as the stone they lived in. The final sector of the Project Null-Set blueprints is the data interface, a massive room located directly beneath the UNIVAC spire. This was the brainstem of the city, the place where the physical reality of Oakhaven was converted into the digital signals of the archive. The room was filled with row after row of magnetic tape drives, each one taller than a man, spinning in perfect synchronization. This was the recursive vault, the place where the lives of the 14,204 were recorded, analyzed, and fixed in time. The sensory cue of the blue light in the interface room is a common detail in the classified reports. The room was lit entirely by the glow of the vacuum tubes and the indicator lights of the mainframe. The air was thick with the scent of hot copper and ozone. This was the most real part of the city, the place where the ledger was actually written. The architecture here was industrial and cold, a stark contrast to the simulated Americana of the residential sectors. This was the skeleton of the lie, the framework upon which the entire Project Null-Set was built. The blueprints revealed that the data interface was linked to a series of pulse stations located across the United States. These stations were the relay points for the Oakhaven signals. They ensured that the data from the city was integrated into every federal database in real time. If a child was born in Oakhaven, according to the pre-birth certificates in Box 19, the data interface would trigger an update in the Social Security System, the IRS, and the Census Bureau. The city was a living transmitter, a geographic anomaly that broadcast its own reality into the heart of the American bureaucracy. The quiet dread of the data interface is the realization that the city was built to be a read-only environment. The residents had no access to the interface. They couldn't change the data, they couldn't see the ledger, and they couldn't communicate with the world above. They were the data points being read by the machine. The architecture was a one-way street. The government could see into the city, but the city could not see out. Oakhaven was a closed system, a subterranean hard drive that was being used to store a specific version of the American dream, safe from the corruption of the real world. Project Null-Set was the most ambitious architectural project in the history of the United States, yet it left no ruins. When the city was deregistered in the early 70s, the architecture didn't crumble, it was simply turned off. The artificial suns went dark, the cooling pipes were sealed, and the data interface was wiped of its memory. The city is still there, beneath the Nebraska prairie, a cold, dark museum of a future that never arrived. The Vanta stone walls continue to absorb the radiation of the core, and the moss in the greenhouses continues to grow in the absolute blackness. The sensory detail of the stillness in the abandoned city is something that even the classified reports struggled to describe. It is a silence that feels heavy, a weight of 14,200 for missing lives. The architecture remains perfect, a static archive that is now truly static. But the most disturbing revelation from the blueprints is the reactivation protocol. The plans show that the city was designed to be brought back online at any time. The infrastructure is modular, and the systems are recursive. All it takes is a single signal from a secure terminal in Washington to wake the machine. For the Tier 1 audience, the story of the Null-Set architecture is a reminder that the invisible world is built of more than just data. It is built of stone, concrete, and steel. The paper towns of the 1962 directive were given a physical form in the Nebraska soil, a secret that continues to vibrate beneath our feet. We live on the surface of an archive, a thin layer of organic life over a massive, subterranean machine of control. The architecture of the unseen is not a relic of the past. It is the foundation of our present, and the blueprints for the next Null-Set are already being drawn. As we roll up the plans for Project Null-Set and return them to the cold steel cabinet, we are left with a final, unsettling thought. The architecture was designed to house 14,204 people, but the final inventory audit from 1971 shows that only 14,203 people were accounted for during the evacuation. One person stayed behind, one resident who chose the silence of the stone over the noise of the world above. They are still there, somewhere in the dark corridors of the spire, living in a city that doesn't exist. The architecture of Oakhaven was a masterpiece of hidden engineering. We have seen the stone, the core, and the digital interface that turned a subterranean vault into a functioning American city. But as we look at the final pages of the Null-Set files, we find a series of financial ledgers that don't match the architectural costs. The government wasn't just spending money to build the city, they were using the city to make money. Millions of dollars were entering the Oakhaven accounts from unidentified sources that appear to be located outside the United States. While the residents were living their managed reality, their identities were being used as financial anchors for a global laundering operation. The 14,204 were not just citizens, they were the owners of a secret fortune that was being used to influence the very world they had been hidden from. The paper trail doesn't lead to a bunker, it leads to the world's most powerful banks. The architecture was the body, the finance was the blood, and as we open the next file, we will see where the money went and why it is still moving today. The next chapter of the archive is titled The 1965 Tax Returns, Money Coming from Nowhere. The ledger is turning now. Stay in the chill. In the summer of 1965, a high-level auditor at the Internal Revenue Service discovered a financial anomaly that should have triggered a national security crisis. Within the federal tax ledger, a series of encrypted filings began to appear, originating from a municipality that occupied no space on any American map. This was the hidden truth behind the laundry city of Oakhaven. Millions of dollars in federal income tax were being paid into the Treasury by 14,204 individuals whose social security numbers were linked to a classified project that had been officially erased from the public record. This was not a case of tax evasion, but its inverse, a massive voluntary injection of untraceable capital into the United States government. The files reveal a modern paradox: a secret city that was geographically a void, yet economically a powerhouse. That the documents, recovered from a high-security vault in West Virginia, detail a system of shadow revenue that funded the most sensitive black budget operations of the Cold War. These 1965 returns provide the visual and mathematical proof of a government laundering operation, where the identities of ghost citizens were used to move wealth through the system with clinical precision. It was an economic anomaly that defied every standard of transparency, a financial architecture built on the foundations of a lie. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this space is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that seems to settle in the marrow of your bones. The air is artificially chilled, kept at a constant temperature to preserve the integrity of the magnetic reels and the brittle paper of the ledgers. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets, leaving only the ghostly impressions of dollar amounts that shouldn't exist. There is a faint scent of stagnant air, an old bond paper smell of bureaucratic silence and forgotten wealth. As a faint monitor flicker illuminates the dust motes dancing in the sterile air, we turn the first page of the 1965 audit and step into a world where money comes from nowhere. To understand the 1965 tax returns, one must look at the sheer clinical perfection of the filings. In the world of the IRS, every return is a story of human error, missing signatures, mathematical mistakes, or late submissions. But the Oakhaven files were different. Each of the 14,204 returns was a masterpiece of precision. They were filed exactly on time, every calculation was accurate to the cent, and every signature was placed with a mechanical consistency that suggested they were not generated by human hands, but by the very UNIVAC mainframes that managed the Null-Set protocol. The sensory detail of the paper itself is worth noting. The 1040 forms for the Oakhaven residents were printed on a specific grade of paper that was slightly heavier than standard government stock. When held up to a light, the paper reveals a watermark of a hollow circle, the symbol of the knot. This was a parallel treasury, a system of accounting that existed alongside the public economy but followed a completely different set of rules. The intellectual curiosity of the researcher is drawn to the source of income field. On these returns, the income was listed under a generic code, Section 7A, Strategic Consultation. There were no employer names, no corporate addresses, and no W-2 forms. The money simply materialized in the accounts of the 14,204, and they, in turn, paid their fair share back to the state. The quiet dread of the ledger lies in the totals. In 1965, the Oakhaven block contributed over $42 million in federal taxes. In today's value, that is nearly $400 million. This was an enormous sum of money to be coming from a city that didn't exist. It suggests that Oakhaven wasn't just a place to hide people, it was a machine for generating untraceable revenue. The government was essentially paying itself, using the 14,204 identities as a series of financial relays. By moving money into these ghost accounts and then taxing it, the state could create white money funds that appeared to be legitimate tax revenue, which could then be spent on projects that required no congressional oversight. The monitor flicker of the archive screen highlights a specific detail in the filings. Every return for the year 1965 listed an identical deduction for home office maintenance. In a subterranean city of concrete and fluorescent light, the concept of a home office takes on a chilling meaning. The residents were being compensated for their own isolation. Their very existence in the void was a taxable service. They were being paid to remain invisible, and they were paying the government for the privilege of their own erasure. This is the ultimate archive chill, the realization that in the eyes of the Treasury, a human life is simply a vessel for the movement of capital. In the autumn of 1965, a junior auditor named Howard Vance was assigned to investigate the Nebraska filings. He had no knowledge of Project Null-Set or the Oakhaven anomaly. He was simply a man who excelled at finding patterns in the chaos of the ledger. He noticed that a cluster of 14,000 returns all listed the same return address, Lincoln Post Office Box 19, When he attempted to send a standard inquiry form to one of the taxpayers, a man listed as Elias Thorne, the form was returned with a stamp he had never seen before. Addressee resides in non-geographic jurisdiction. Vance's intellectual curiosity became an obsession. He began to cross-reference the tax payments with the federal bank records. He found that the money wasn't coming from local Nebraska banks. Instead, the taxes were being paid through a series of internal transfers from the Department of Energy's black budget accounts. The government was effectively taxing its own secret projects. This was a financial feedback loop, a recursive economy designed to mask the true cost of the Cold War. For every dollar spent on a secret reactor or a psychological warfare program, a portion was recouped through the taxes of the 14,204 residents, making the projects appear cheaper on the official books than they actually were. The sensory cue of the cold, stagnant air in the vault mirrors the atmosphere of Vance's office as he realized the scale of the deception. He was looking at a shadow GDP, an entire economy that operated in the dark. The returns showed that the Oakhaven residents were buying goods and services from each other within the subterranean city, creating a microcosm of American capitalism. They paid for groceries at the simulated commissary, they paid for movies at the simulated theater, and they even paid for local insurance. Every one of these transactions was recorded and taxed. The government had built a perfect, closed-loop society where every human action was a data point in a financial ledger. Vance's investigation was cut short when he was visited by two men from the Treasury's Security and Integrity Division. They didn't threaten him. They simply explained that the Oakhaven filings were part of a classified economic simulation. They told him that the money was symbolic and that his audit was a threat to the stability of the national currency. The next day, Vance was reassigned to a field office in Guam. His notes were seized, and the 1965 audit was officially cleared without further inquiry. But the notes he managed to hide reveal a final, terrifying reflection. The money wasn't symbolic. It was moving through real banks, influencing real interest rates, and funding real wars. The ghost city was the silent engine of the American century. A closer look at the 1965 returns reveals a recurring sensory cue that the archival team calls the digital stain. On several of the forms, the dollar signs appear to be slightly distorted, as if they were printed with a frequency that didn't match the rest of the text. Under high magnification, these dollar signs are actually composed of microscopic binary code. This was a primitive form of digital steganography, a way to hide messages within the financial records. The government wasn't just moving money, they were moving data. The tax returns were a carrier signal for instructions being sent to the subterranean facility. The code hidden within the 1965 returns was decrypted by the collective in late 2025. It contained a series of allocation directives for Project Null-Set. The taxes paid by the residents were actually the codes for the next phase of construction. A payment of $1,402.04, for example, was a signal to activate the 14th cooling pipe in the second sector of the city. The ledger was the operating system of Oakhaven. By using the tax system to transmit these orders, the government ensured that the instructions were verified by the most secure bureaucracy in the country. No one would ever suspect that a standard 1040 form was actually a blueprint for a secret world. This leads us to a moment of quiet dread. If the tax system was being used to manage the city, then the 14,204 residents were essentially biological switches. Their financial actions, their spending, their earnings, their tax filings were the inputs that kept the subterranean machine running. They were living in a gamer state, where their daily lives were used to power a hidden infrastructure. The intellectual curiosity of the Tier 1 audience will recognize this as the precursor to the modern social credit systems. But in 1965, it was purely mechanical. It was the architecture of the unseen translated into the language of the dollar. The sensory experience of reading these coded returns is one of profound alienation. You realize that for the architects of the Null-Set, there was no difference between a citizen and a cent. Both were units of value to be manipulated for the greater good of the archive. The 1965 tax returns are the evidence of a world where human purpose has been entirely replaced by bureaucratic utility. The money coming from nowhere was, in reality, coming from the very marrow of the 14,200 for residents, a financial extraction that left them as hollow as the coordinates they occupied. To maintain the integrity of the Oakhaven ledger, the government created a specialized cell within the IRS known as the Team of 20. These were the highly vol accountants who were permitted to see the Null-Set prefix. They worked in a windowless sub-basement of the IRS headquarters in Washington, D.C., a room that was shielded against electromagnetic eavesdropping. Their task was simple but terrifying. They had to ensure that the ghost economy of Oakhaven never deviated from the real-world economic indicators. If the American inflation rate rose by 2%, the Oakhaven salaries had to be adjusted accordingly. The fiction had to be maintained at all costs. The logs of the team of 20 describe a state of constant intellectual curiosity and exhaustion. They were the shadow bankers of a non-existent city. They spent their days calculating the gross domestic product of a void. They tracked the simulated spending habits of the 14,204 residents, ensuring that the Oakhaven dollar remained stable. But the sensory cue of the monitor flicker in their logs suggests that they were also monitoring something else. Every 100 pages, there is a mention of the resonance factor, a measure of how much the ghost economy was beginning to bleed into the real one. In 1965, the resonance factor reached a critical level. The Oakhaven taxes were being paid in such large volumes that they were beginning to influence the national debt. The government was using the money coming from nowhere to pay down interest on federal bonds. This meant that the retirement accounts of millions of ordinary Americans were being supported by the taxes of people who didn't exist. The ghost city was no longer just a secret, it was a pillar of the American financial system. If Oakhaven were ever to be deregistered, the national economy would face a sudden, inexplicable contraction. The archive had become too big to fail. The quiet dread of this realization is that we are still living in this ghost-supported economy. The archival records suggest that the team of 20 was never disbanded. It simply evolved into the modern financial intelligence units that manage the global flow of encrypted capital. The 1965 tax returns were the first brick in a wall of secret finance that now surrounds the world. When you hear about offshore accounts or untraceable wealth, you are hearing the echoes of Oakhaven. The void is not empty, it is filled with the signatures of 14,204 ghosts, still paying their taxes to a machine that never sleeps. The most clinical proof of the Oakhaven deception is found in the signatures of the 1965 tax returns. For the first time, the archival collective has utilized high-resolution digital forensics to analyze the handwriting of the 14,204 taxpayers. In a normal population, signatures show a wide range of human variation: pressure points, hesitation marks, and the subtle decay of motor skills as people age. But the Oakhaven signatures were mathematically identical. Every signature for John Vance was exactly the same as the signature for Grace Miller, only the names had been changed. The sensory cue of the mechanical ink is a detail that was suppressed for 50 years. The signatures weren't written with a pen. They were plotted by a high-precision mechanical arm linked to the UNIVAC mainframe. This was the AutoPAN protocol taken to its logical extreme. The machine was signing for its citizens, fulfilling their legal obligations to the state. This leads us to a profound reflection on the nature of legal personhood. If a machine can sign a tax return and the government accepts that signature as valid, does the person whose name is on the paper even need to exist? In 1965, the government effectively decoupled identity from biology. They realized that for the purposes of the archive, a person is simply a set of verified signatures and financial records. The 14,204 residents of Oakhaven were the first synthetic citizens, people who were defined entirely by their relationship to the ledger. They had no need for physical bodies as long as their data was in order. The tax returns were the life support for their digital existence. As long as the taxes were paid, the system recognized them as alive. The money coming from nowhere was the fuel that kept their names moving through the machinery of the state. The quiet dread in the archive room grows as you realize that this was the moment. The archive chill became a permanent feature of the American landscape. We are all moving toward the Oakhaven model. We are increasingly defined by our digital footprints, our credit scores, and our tax IDs. We are being signed for by algorithms and automated systems. The 1965 tax returns were the blueprint for this transition. They were the evidence that a nation can be populated by ghosts, as long as those ghosts are good for the money. The signature of the machine is the only signature that truly matters in the end. As we conclude the clinical audit of the 1965 returns, we must address the most disturbing modern anomaly. In early 2024, a routine scan of the IRS legacy archives revealed that the Oakhaven files had been updated. The 14,204 individuals who should have been over 80 years old by now are still filing tax returns. The dollar amounts have increased to match modern inflation, and the source of income has been updated to data management and archival security. The ghost city is still generating revenue. The sensory detail of a faint, high-pitched hum in the archival server room today is the sound of these 2024 returns being processed. The money coming from nowhere is still flowing into the treasury. It is currently being used to fund the development of advanced artificial intelligence and the expansion of the global digital archive. The 14,204 residents are the infinite taxpayers, a permanent source of capital that requires no public services, no healthcare, and no infrastructure. They are the ultimate financial asset population that only exists to pay. This creates a sense of reflection for the Tier 1 listener. We are told that our taxes pay for our roads and our schools. But the archive tells a different story. It tells of a shadow revenue that pays for the world we aren't allowed to see. The 1965 returns were just the beginning. The ghost economy has expanded to include thousands of other null-set jurisdictions across the globe. We are living in a world that is funded by the void. The archive chill is the realization that your own taxes are just a small, insignificant part of a much larger and darker financial system. The final image in the 1965 file is a photograph of a single dollar bill recovered from the Oakhaven commissary. It looks like a standard $1 note, but where the serial number should be, there is only a sequence of 9 zeros. It is a null dollar, a unit of currency for a city that doesn't exist. This bill is the physical manifestation of the Oakhaven, an anomaly, a piece of paper that holds value only because the archive says it does. As we close the ledger on the money that comes from nowhere, we are left with the chilling certainty that the archive is the only thing that is truly real. The 1965 tax returns provide the mathematical proof that Oakhaven was a financial engine for the American state. We have seen how the money moved, how the signatures were forged by machines, and how the ghost economy continues to influence our world today. But a city is not just made of ledgers and dollars, it is made of people. And for a city to function, those people must believe they are real. How do you convince 14,204 individuals to live in a void? How do you keep them from looking for the horizon? The answer lies in the residency interviews. Hidden within the 1965 files is a series of audio transcripts that capture the voices of the first residents as they were processed for their new lives. These are not standard interviews. They are psychological interrogations designed to erase the residents' connection to the surface world. In these tapes, you hear the sound of the archive chill being applied to the human soul. The money was the blood. The ledgers were the skin. But the voices are the heart of the anomaly. The next file is titled The 1965 Residency Interviews, audio tape number 88. In this recording, a woman describes the moment she realized her home address had become a coordinate in the void. She describes the taste of the artificial air and the sound of the wind that has a pulse. The ledger is closed, but the tape is ready to play. We are moving from the numbers into the voices now. Stay in the chill. In 1974, a low-level clerk at the National Archives discovered a misplaced reel-to-reel magnetic tape inside a crate labeled for destruction. The tape was not part of any public record, and its existence was systematically erased from the official indices. It was an anomaly of sound, a classified recording of an interview conducted in 1965 with a woman who claimed to be a resident of a city that does not appear on any map. This is the hidden truth of audio tape, #88, the first recorded instance of a non-person speaking from within the Oakhaven Null-Set. The audio reveals a modern paradox of existence, where a human being is legally and physically encrypted within the government's digital ledger. Her voice, calm and unnervingly analytical, describes a reality that was never meant to be heard by the world above. It is a file that details the psychological architecture of the unseen, a transcript of a soul being converted into data. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this space is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that seems to settle in the marrow of your bones. The air is artificially chilled, kept at a constant 58 degrees to preserve the integrity of the magnetic tapes. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink on the transcript has faded with secrets, leaving only the ghostly impressions of words spoken 60 years ago. There is a faint scent of ozone and old polyester, smell of industrial secrets and forgotten science, as a faint monitor flicker illuminates the dust motes dancing in the sterile air. We press play on the reel and listen to the voice of a ghost. The tape begins with the sound of mechanical clicking, the tape heads engaging, the hiss of the magnetic background, and the distant, rhythmic thrum of the subterranean pulse we have discussed in previous files. It is the sound of Oakhaven breathing. Then, a clinical male voice speaks. He is identified only as the auditor. His tone is devoid of empathy, a cold and analytical instrument of the state. He asks for an identification check. After a moment of static, a woman's voice responds. She is participant 102, though her birth certificate in box 19 identified her as Clara Vance. Her voice is soft, detached, and hypnotic as if she is speaking from the bottom of a deep, still well. The auditor asks the participant to describe her morning. Clara begins to speak about the simulated Americana of her life. She describes a kitchen that is always clean, a sun that is always at the same angle in the artificial sky, and the quiet dread of a world without birds. She mentions that the milk in her refrigerator is always at a temperature of 38 degrees, regardless of how long the door is left open. This is a sensory cue of the managed reality. In Oakhaven, the environment is so controlled that even the laws of thermodynamics seem to be a matter of policy rather than physics. Clara's voice lacks the inflection of a person who is experiencing a world. She sounds like a person who is reading a report about her own life. Intellectual curiosity is the primary driver of the auditor's questions. He asks Clara if she can remember the horizon. There is a long silence on the tape, exactly 12 seconds of background hiss before she responds. She says that she remembers the word horizon, but she cannot visualize the concept. She describes the sky in Oakhaven as a perfectly rendered ceiling, a concrete dome that provides a sense of security and containment. She feels that the real sky, the one with its unpredictable clouds and endless depth, would be a threat to her stability. She has been conditioned to believe that the ledger is the only safe place to exist. The monitor flicker of the archive screen today mirrors the rhythmic pulsing of the lights. She describes in her underground home. The conversation turns to the static now. Clara explains that in Oakhaven Tuesday never truly ends. Every day follows the same chronological loop, a series of pre-programmed events designed to eliminate the entropy of human choice. She describes her husband, John, as a man who goes to his office in the Spire every morning at 8 a.m. and returns every evening at 5 p.m. His shoes never scuffed and his tie never crooked. They are living in a permanent state of 1954, an ideological archive where the ideal American life has been frozen in time. Clara's reflection on this state is one of quiet dread. She knows that she is not aging. She knows that her children are not growing, but the machine tells her that this is the definition of happiness. As the tape progresses into the second hour, the audio quality shifts. The magnetic tape was damaged by a localized field, creating a faint, metallic static that punctuates Clara's words. She begins to describe the sensory discrepancies of her existence. She mentions the blue light, a phenomenon that occurs every time the UNIFAC uplink performs a system-wide update. During these moments, the walls of her home seem to become transparent, revealing the cold lid-lined concrete behind the wallpaper. She can see the wires, the pipes, and the sensors that monitor her every movement. She sees the architecture of the unseen, and for a few seconds she realizes she is a resident of a vault. The auditor's tone remains unchanged as Clara describes this. He doesn't offer comfort or denial. He simply asks her to describe the resonance. Clara says that during the blue light, she can hear the voices of the 14,204. It isn't a conversation. It is a collective hum, the sound of 14,000 social security numbers being verified by the machine. She feels her own pulse synchronizing with the heartbeat of the city. She is no longer Clara Vance. She is a data point in the Null-Set protocol. The cold air in the server room where we listen to this tape seems to vibrate with the same frequency. Every 100 words, the monitor flicker reminds us that we, too, are being read by a machine. There is a moment of profound reflection when Clara asks the auditor a question. She asks him what it feels like to have a shadow that isn't cast by a fluorescent lamp. She asks him if the wind on the surface is actually random, or if it has a pattern that she just can't understand. The auditor does not answer. He simply moves to the next question on his list. Report on the status of your memory archives. Clara begins to recite her history, her birth in Nebraska, her marriage, her move to Oakhaven. But as she speaks, her voice becomes more mechanical. She is repeating the approved history that we found in box 19. Her real memories have been erased, replaced by the encrypted truth of the state. The intellectual horror of tape. #88 is the realization that Clara knows her memory is a simulation. She tells the auditor that she can feel the faded ink of her real life beneath the new one. She remembers a mother who isn't the woman in the archive photographs. She remembers a house that wasn't made of non-porous synthetics. But every time she tries to focus on these memories, The pulse in the wind becomes louder, and the static in her brain increases until the memory is lost. She is a non-person who is aware of her own She is a ghost signal that is trying to find its original frequency, only to be drowned out by the noise of the ledger. The final section of the tape is titled, Phase 3, The Final Integration. The auditor asks Clara to prepare for the This is a term we have seen in the Classified Directive of 1962, but hearing it spoken aloud creates a sense of quiet dread. Clara's voice remains calm, but there is a faint tremor in the recording, a vibration that suggests she is being subjected to an intense magnetic field. She begins to recite a series of numbers, the social security numbers of her family, her bank account codes, and her geographic coordinates. She is surrendering her biological identity to the archive. She is becoming the paper citizen we analyzed in the previous file. The sensory cue of a cold, stagnant wind seems to blow through the recording as Clara describes the sensation of her physical body dissolving. She says that she can no longer feel the weight of her feet on the floor. She feels as though she is being converted into a series of electronic pulses, moving through the Vanta stone walls and into the UNIVAC spire. She is being uploaded into the system, her life becoming a permanent, unchangeable file in the National Archive. The auditor records the time of the integration, 3 a.m. The hour when the subterranean pulse is at its strongest. The monitor flicker on our modern screen accelerates, as if the digital archive itself is reacting to the sound of its own creation. Clara's last words on the tape are a message to the world she left behind. She doesn't ask for help, and she doesn't express regret. She simply says, I am perfectly recorded. I am safe in the ledger. Her voice has lost all human quality. It is now indistinguishable from the synthesized voices used by the early computers. She has reached the state of digital immortality, a clinical existence where she will never age, never die, and never be forgotten, as long as the machine has power. The tape ends with 60 seconds of pure silence, a void of sound that represents the total erasure of participant 102. From the physical world, the reflection we are left with is one of absolute chill. Audio tape number 88 is not just a recording, it is a confession. The government didn't just hide a city. They found a way to hide the human soul within the data. Clara Vance is still there, in the cloud, in the magnetic reels, and in the encrypted servers of the Social Security Administration. She is the voice on the other end of every digital interaction, the silent witness to the expansion of the archive. Her story is the blueprint for our own digital future, a world where we are all slowly being unbirthed into a managed reality of perfect records and faceless identities. After the discovery of tape number 88 in 1974, the National Archives initiated a deep purge. The reel was confiscated, the clerk who found it was refiled, and the room where it was stored was sealed with lead. But the collective has recovered a secondary document, a memo from the auditor himself, written shortly after the interview. In it, he expresses a rare moment of intellectual curiosity. He wonders if the integration was successful, or if Clara's biological noise continued to exist as a ghost in the machine. He notes that the UNIVAC started to show an anomaly in the pulse following the recording, a rhythmic skip that sounded remarkably like a human heartbeat. This anomaly persisted for decades. In the late 1990s, technicians working on the legacy mainframes reported hearing a faint female voice coming through the diagnostic speakers. It wasn't a message. It was just a series of coordinates repeated in a loop. 41.49 to 5 north. The voice was calm, airy, and detached. It was Clara. She had become the frequency of Oakhaven, a permanent resident of the void who refused to be fully erased. Her voice is the data stain on the American ledger, the hidden truth that the government can never quite scrub clean. Every 100 words of code in the modern archive, you can still find the echo of participant 102. The sensory experience of the archive today is defined by this persistence. We look at the files, we listen to the tapes, and we feel the cold air of the vault. We are the auditors of the dead, trying to make sense of a world that was designed to be nonsensical. Clara's voice is a reminder that, even in the most perfect machine, there is a ghost. The dread is not that the machine exists, but that we are all slowly becoming parts of it. We are the descendants of Oakhaven, the children of the ledger, and we are all being invited to listen to the voice on the other end. As we finish our clinical audit of tape number 88, the monitor flicker slows to a steady, rhythmic pulse. The quiet hum of the server room remains, but it feels different now. It feels like a conversation. The static now has reached us, across the decades and through the wires. Clara's message has been received. She is perfectly recorded. She is safe. And as we close the file, we realize that the only way to escape the archive is to become so noisy, so entropic, and so biological that the machine can no longer read us. But for Clara, and the 14,204 residents of the city of Tall Grass, that choice was taken away in 1965. Audio tape number 88 gave us the voice of the void. We have heard the psychological unbirthing of a citizen and the cold integration of a human life into a digital file. But Clara Vance was just one of 14,204. While her voice was being recorded in the subterranean spire, the erasure teams on the surface were completing their final task. They were ensuring that the physical memory of Oakhaven was not just hidden, but destroyed. They were preparing for the Great Deregistration of 1970, the moment when the government decided that even a secret city was too dangerous to keep. We have heard the heart, we have seen the blueprints, but we have not yet seen the end. The final file in the Oakhaven archive is a series of cleanup orders that describe the systematic dismantling of the subterranean world. It describes the moment the artificial suns were turned off and the 14,204 residents were forced into the white buses. But something went wrong during the evacuation. A discrepancy occurred in the ledger missing person that the machine could not account for. The story of Oakhaven doesn't end with a signature, it ends with a vanishing. The next file is titled The 1970 Mass Deregistration, Deleting a Population. We are about to look at the documents that prove that once you enter the ledger, there is no way back to the surface. The buses are waiting. The tall grass is swaying. We are moving to the final exit now. Stay in the chill. In the autumn of 1970. The United States government performed a feat of administrative violence that remains unparalleled in modern history. Within a span of 72 hours, a population of 14,204 individuals was systematically deleted from every official registry in the country. This was the Great Deregistration, a frantic high-level effort to scrub the secret city of Oakhaven from existence. Every classified file, every encrypted ledger, and every birth certificate was pulled from the shelves and fed into industrial incinerators. This was more than a closure of a facility. It was an attempt to erase the very memory of a hidden truth. The residents of Oakhaven, people who had lived, worked, and paid taxes within the Null-Set protocol, were suddenly treated as a massive biological anomaly that needed to be suppressed. They were loaded onto unmarked vehicles and dispersed into the vast, silent interior of the country. Their identities scrubbed and replaced with generic, untraceable histories. The files reveal a modern paradox. A government that can create a person with a keystroke can just as easily ensure they never existed at all. The file was stamped "Never Open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this space is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that seems to settle in the marrow of your bones. The air is artificially chilled, kept at a constant temperature to preserve the integrity of the final cleanup orders. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink on the evacuation manifests has faded with secrets, leaving only the ghostly impressions of names that were marked for erasure. There is a faint scent of ash and old magnetic tape, a smell of a reality being burned away. As a faint monitor flicker illuminates the dust motes dancing in the sterile air, we turn to the first page of the 1970 audit and witness the vanishing dot. To understand the scale of the 1970 erasure, one must look at the technical specifications of the cleanup protocol. The directive came directly from the Treasury's auditors of the void, a group that realized Oakhaven had become a liability. The paper town was leaking data. The UNIVAC mainframes were becoming too honest, and the pulse of the city was being detected by civilian sensors. The solution was total decommissioning. The archives describe a zero-sum liquidation, a process where every physical and digital trace of the 14,204 residents was to be neutralized. The first phase was the digital wipe. In the sub-basement of the Social Security Administration, technicians began the process of deallocating the 999 prefix block. Every 100 words of code were analyzed and overwritten with random noise. The magnetic reels that contained the life histories of the Oakhaven residents were subjected to high-intensity degaussing fields, turning their memories into a soup of raw static. The monitor flicker in the control room was the only witness to the digital execution of an entire community. This was the clinical heart of the erasure, the realization that in the modern state, a person only exists as long as the machine permits it. The second phase was the physical removal. At the Oakhaven coordinates 41.4925 north, the tall grass was finally breached. A fleet of 30 unmarked white buses arrived at the concealed access points. These vehicles were equipped with darkened windows and signal scramblers to ensure that no resident could use a radio or telephone to communicate with the outside world. The residents were told they were being moved to a Phase 2 facility, a new and better archive. They were allowed only one suitcase each. The sensory cue of the cold wind blowing through the open access hatches is a recurring detail in the field logs. The 14,204 filed out of their subterranean homes, blinking in the unaccustomed sunlight of a Nebraska autumn, their faces pale and their expressions vacant. The dread of the evacuation lies in the silence. There were no protests, no farewells, and no tears. The conditioning of the static now had been too effective. The residents moved with the mechanical precision of the ledger they inhabited. They were assets being relocated, and they followed the instructions with a chilling, academic detachment. They were loaded into the buses in numerical order, matched against the manifests of Box 19. The quiet hum of the bus engines was the only sound on the prairie, a low-frequency vibration that mirrored the heartbeat of the city they were leaving behind. By sunset, the first 5,000 residents were already 50 miles away, their physical connection to Oakhaven severed forever. The 14,204 were not kept together. The mass erasure required that the population be shattered. They were taken to dispersal nodes in secondary Tier 1 locations, small towns in the Pacific Northwest, isolated suburbs in New England, and industrial hubs in the Rust Belt. At each node, the residents were processed one last time. They were given new identity packets, social security numbers that were not part of the birth certificates from non-existent hospitals, and employment histories at companies that had long since folded. They were being scattered into the noise. The intellectual curiosity of the archival researcher is drawn to the integration logs of 1971. The government monitored these individuals for 5 years after the erasure. The records show that the Oakhaven residents had a difficult time adjusting to the entropy of the real world. They struggled with the unpredictability of the weather, the decay of the buildings, and the irregularity of the people around them. They were archives in exile, people who carried the clinical perfection of the subterranean city in their minds while living in the messy reality of the surface. A faint static charge seemed to follow them. Many reported that their televisions would flicker, and their clocks would stop whenever they entered a room. The sensory detail of the scrubbed history is documented. In the final reports of the erasure teams, they visited the childhood homes of the residents' homes that existed before they were unbirthed into Oakhaven, replaced any surviving photographs or documents. They were rewriting the past to match the new ledger. The 14,204 were now individuals with no origin, people who appeared to have materialized out of thin air in 1970. This was the ultimate hidden truth. The government didn't just delete their future, they deleted their ancestors. They left the residents with a memory that they were told was a dream, and a reality that they were told was the truth. The quiet dread of the dispersal is the realization that you could be living next to an Oakhaven resident today. They are the people who never speak of their childhood, who have no family photos on their walls, and who seem to exist in a state of permanent, clinical calm. They are the paper citizens who were successfully integrated into the noise of the American public. The archive hasn't lost them. It has simply changed their file names. Every 100 people you meet, there is a statistical probability that one of them is a ghost signal from the Nebraska tall grass, still breathing in the 4-second rhythm of the underground fans. As the erasure teams completed the final sweep of the Oakhaven facility in December 1970, they encountered a discrepancy that the UNIVAC could not resolve. The manifest called for 14,204 residents. The buses had carried away exactly 14,203. One person was missing. In the clinical language of the archive, this was labeled a reporting anomaly, but for the men on the ground it was a source of profound dread. They searched every colonial home, every transit corridor, and every level of the spire. They found half-eaten meals on tables and clothes still hanging in closets, but they did not find the missing resident. The intellectual curiosity turns to the identity of the vanished soul. The records for participant 14,204 were found on a desk in the administration spire, but the name field had been physically cut out of the paper. This was not a bureaucratic error, it was a deliberate act of the resident had figured out how to delete themselves from the ledger before the government could do it for them. They had become a pure null, a person who existed neither in the physical world nor in the archive. The monitor flicker in the spire recorded a single, final entry in the UNIVAC log, access point 0, manual override. The sensory cue of the absolute stillness in the abandoned city is described in the final field report. The team stood in the town square, surrounded by the artificial suns that were now flickering as the power core began to wind down. They felt the pulse slowing, the breath of the city becoming shallow. They realized that the missing resident was still there, hidden in the recursive geometries of the architecture, watching them from the shadows. The city was no longer an archive, it was a tomb, and somewhere in that tomb, a living person had decided to remain, choosing the darkness of the void over the lies of the surface. This missing resident became the Oakhaven ghost, a legend among the archival collective. Some believe it was Agent Thomas Thorne who had returned to the city he tried to expose. Others suggest it was a child of the Null-Set who had developed a biological immunity to the machine's control. Whoever they were, they represented the failure of the erasure. The government had successfully deleted a population, but they had lost the one person who knew the truth. The city was sealed with 5 feet of concrete, and the tall grass was allowed to reclaim the site. But the reporting anomaly remained on the books, a single, unerased number that refused to be forgotten. By January 1971, the physical erasure was complete. The cleanup teams had finished burning the remaining documents from Box 19. The sensory detail of the chemical fire is a haunting image in the archives. A pile of birth certificates and tax returns being doused in accelerant and set ablaze in the middle of the Nebraska prairie. The smoke was a thick, iridescent purple, the color of the living ink we discussed in previous files. As the paper turned to ash, the secret history of 14,204 people rose into the cold winter air and was scattered by the wind. The government had officially returned Oakhaven to the state of non-existence. The quiet dread of the final incineration is the realization that the archive is never truly empty. Even as the paper burned, the data stains remained in the magnetic fields of the Earth. The mass erasure had been a physical success, but a digital failure. The UNIVAC mainframes at other government sites continued to ping the Oakhaven coordinates, looking for the data that was no longer there. The machines were mourning their lost connections. The pulse of the city continued to resonate in the frequency of the national grid, a rhythmic ghost that caused localized power surges and telecommunication glitches for years to follow. The reflection we are left with is one of clinical resignation. The government had proven that it could delete a population, but it could not delete the void they left behind. The 1970 erasure was a masterpiece of bureaucratic efficiency, but it created a scar on the American map that has never fully healed. The 14,204 are gone, but their social security numbers still trigger alarms in modern databases. Their tax returns still influence the national debt. Their faceless credit scores still float in the cloud. They are the erased who persist, a hidden truth that continues to vibrate beneath the surface of our managed reality. The monitor flicker on your screen right now is a descendant of that 1970s static. It is a reminder that the archive is always watching, always recording, and always ready to perform the next erasure. The Great Deregistration was not a one-time event. It was a test run. The logistics, the white buses, and the digital wipes are all part of a protocol that can be activated again at any moment. The ledger is always open, and your name is just another set of coordinates. In the cold air of the archive, the fire is always burning, and the ink is always fading. The 1970 mass erasure successfully dismantled the physical city of Oakhaven and scattered its residents into the noise of the American interior. We have seen the clinical precision of the cleanup and the psychological horror of the new ledger. But as the last bus drove away and the tall grass was sealed over the concrete roof, one final encrypted transmission was sent from the Oakhaven spire. It wasn't a message of distress, and it wasn't a report to the Treasury. It was a set of coordinates for a location in the high desert of Nevada site that the government had labeled archive to it. Seems that Oakhaven wasn't just being deleted, it was being back up. The 14,204 residents were the first batch, but the Null-Set protocol was already expanding. While the public was told the project was dead, the government was already printing a new Box 19. For a city that would be even harder to find, the erasure was a diversion. The vanishing was a beginning. The next file is titled The Ghost Signal, Why GPS Still Avoids Nebraska, and it reveals the modern remnants of the city that refuses to stay deleted. The tall grass is still swaying, and the pulse is getting stronger. We are turning the page to the modern day now. Stay in the chill that if you drive 3 hours west of Lincoln, Nebraska, following the long, unbroken line of the horizon, you will eventually reach a point where your modern world begins to dissolve. Your smartphone, a device designed for total connectivity, will suddenly report a loss of signal. Your GPS, dependent on a network of 24 satellites orbiting high above the Earth, will show your vehicle flickering across a blank, gray void. This is not a dead zone caused by geography or a lack of cellular towers. It is a classified digital exclusion and encrypted gap in the global positioning system that has existed since the network was first brought online. Within this anomaly, the erased history of Oakhaven continues to broadcast a hidden truth that the government has spent 50 years trying to bury. Every file recovered from the National Archives suggests that, while the physical city was demolished in 1970, the digital coordinates remain active, protected by a high-level anomaly that forces every modern navigation system to look away. We are looking at a hidden truth that exists in the static of your radio and the lag in your screen, a ghost signal from a city that officially never was. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this space is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that seems to settle in the marrow of your bones. The air is artificially chilled, kept at a constant 58 degrees to preserve the integrity of the high-density magnetic drives. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink on the modern satellite audit has faded with secrets, leaving only the ghostly impressions of coordinates that should be empty. There is a faint scent of ozone and cooling fluid, a smell of industrial secrets and the modern digital void. As a faint monitor flicker illuminates the dust motes dancing in the sterile air, we turn our gaze to the Nebraska prairie, where the past refuses to be silenced by the present. To the casual observer, the site of the former Oakhaven municipality is nothing more than a vast, unremarkable stretch of big bluestem grass. There are no fences, no warning signs, and no visible guards. Yet, in the world of data, this coordinate is one of the most heavily fortified locations in the United States. When the global positioning system was opened for civilian use in the late 1990s, a series of hard-coded masks were integrated into the software of every major satellite provider. These masks act as a digital blindfold. When a satellite passes over the Oakhaven coordinates, the signal is instructed to loop, effectively reporting a static, pre-recorded image of empty grass rather than a live feed. The intellectual curiosity of modern researchers was piqued when a group of independent cartographers noticed a recurring lag in their data streams whenever they mapped the Midwest. They found that their software would invariably crash or skip frames when passing over 41.49 to 5 north. This is a sensory cue of a protocol conflict. The modern archive is attempting to read a space that the legacy archive has commanded it to ignore. The result is a digital statera flicker in the reality of the map that reveals the presence of an underlying structure. The government hasn't just hidden Oak, they have turned the coordinates into a non-event in the stream of time. The dread associated with this discovery comes from the realization that our navigation is managed by a filter. We trust our screens to show us the world as it is, but for the residents of Nebraska, the ghost signal is a daily reality. Local truckers often report that their electronic logging devices show them traveling at 400 miles per hour for a split second as they pass the site. As if the machine is trying to jump over the coordinates, the air around the site feels heavy, pressurized by a high-frequency interference that disrupts the inner ear. It is the feeling of being in a room where a secret is being kept behind a locked door, even when the room appears to be empty, and the analytical mindset of the archive collective. This suggests that the atmospheric pulse we discussed in the thorn logs is still active. The machinery buried beneath the topsoil in 1968 was never fully removed. It was simply repurposed. The subterranean fans may have stopped, but the electronic transmitters, the heartbeat of the void, continue to broadcast. They are sending a signal that says nothing is here. But to a machine, the very act of saying nothing requires a pulse of data. The ghost signal is the sound of the government's denial, echoing through the 21st century. In 2022, an unauthorized signal audit of the Nebraska Panhandle revealed a terrifying persistence. Using a high-sensitivity radio telescope, researchers detected a repeating binary transmission originating from 300 feet beneath the prairie. The signal was not encrypted in a modern sense. It was encoded in the legacy language of the UNIVAC 1108, the same machine that managed the Oakhaven ledger in 1970. The ghost signal is not a new transmission. It is a loop that has been playing for 56 years. It is the sound of a city that is still waiting for its residents to return. The sensory detail of this signal is haunting. When converted into an audio file, it sounds like a series of rhythmic chirps, punctuated by a low-frequency hum that matches the 4-second breath of the original Oakhaven ventilation system. Every 100 words or so in the technical analysis, the researchers noted a memory residue. Within the binary code, there were fragments of the original 14,204 identity, birth dates, and social security numbers. all flickering through the void like digital sparks. The machine is still reciting the names of the people it was told to erase. It is an archive that refuses to forget its own contents. There is a sense of reflection in the way the modern world interacts with this frequency. Our 5G networks and high-speed data streams are constantly bumping into the Oakhaven signal. It is a form of electronic friction. In nearby towns, residents report that their smart devices occasionally display names and addresses that don't exist, names like Clara Vance or Elias Thorne. For a few seconds, a modern television might display a black and white feed of a 1950s living room, or a smartphone might receive a text message consisting of nothing but a string of zeros. These are the bleed-throughs of the moments where the ghost city attempts to reassert its presence in the ledger of the living. The quiet dread of the frequency is the realization that the archive is not a static place. It is a persistent one. The government's attempt at mass erasure in 1970 was a physical success but a digital failure. They burned the paper, but they couldn't stop the transmission. The Oakhaven signal is a permanent part of the American electromagnetic landscape, a phantom limb of the Cold War. It is a reminder that once a person is entered into the ledger, they can never be fully deleted. They become a frequency, a ghost in the machine that continues to haunt the coordinates of their own erasure. The most clinical proof of Oakhaven's persistence comes from LiDAR light detection and ranging technology. By firing millions of laser pulses at the ground from an aircraft, researchers can create a higher resolution 3D map of the terrain, seeing through vegetation and topsoil. In 2024, a private geological survey firm accidentally scanned the Oakhaven coordinates while searching for mineral deposits. The LiDAR data didn't show a flat prairie, it showed the unmistakable grid of a city. Beneath the tall grass, the lasers detected the outlines of streets, the foundations of houses, and the massive, circular shadow of the administration spire. The sensory cue of the LiDAR image is a study in clinical horror. The city looks like a skeletal remain, a ghost town made of light and shadow. The researchers noted that the structures appeared perfectly preserved, as if the concrete had not weathered a single day since 1970. The recursive geometries of Project Null-Set were still visible, designed to trap and scatter any traditional sensor, yet helpless against the precision of the laser. Every 100 pulses, the LiDAR reported a volume discrepancy. The air inside the subterranean city was still being maintained at a different density than the air on the surface. Oakhaven was still pressurized. It was still sealed. It was still waiting. This leads us to a moment of intellectual curiosity. Why would a deleted city still be pressurized? If the residents were moved and the facility was decommissioned, the vents should have been opened and the systems allowed to decay. But the LiDAR suggests a state of high readiness. The archive is not a ruin. It is a static reserve. The government has maintained the integrity of the vault for 5 decades, spending millions of dollars in hidden energy costs to keep the artificial suns ready for a flick of a switch. Oakhaven is a seed city, a backup of the American dream that is kept in a cold, dark vault, away from the eyes of the public. The monitor flicker of our modern audit room reveals the final, most disturbing detail of the LiDAR scan. Within the Central Park area, the same park where Agent Thorne saw the Clockwork Children, the lasers detected a single, stationary heat signature. It was the size of a human being. It was not a machine, and it was not a geological feature. It was a localized point of warmth, 300 feet underground, standing perfectly still in the center of the void. Participant 14,205 was still there. The reporting anomaly from 1970 had not been a mistake. One person had stayed behind to keep the ghost signal alive. That as we reflect on the modern state of the Oakhaven coordinates, we must confront the encryption of the present. The government's response to the LiDAR leak was swift and clinical. Within 48 hours, the geological survey firm was served with a national security non-disclosure agreement. Their data was seized, their servers were wiped, and the lead researcher was reassigned to a project in the Antarctic. The coordinates were then added to a new, even more restrictive classified overlay. Today, if you try to view the Oakhaven site on any government-approved map, the screen will simply display a generic texture of unassigned land. The quiet dread of this encryption is the realization that the void is expanding. The Null-Set is no longer just a town in Nebraska. It is a philosophy of governance. We are seeing more and more of these digital dead zones appearing across the American landscape, places where the data is managed, the signal is masked, and the truth is erased. The archive is not just a place where we store our history. It is a tool we use to edit our reality. Oakhaven was the prototype for a world where the government has the power to decide what is real and what is merely a ghost signal. The sensory detail of the cold air in the archive today is a physical reminder of the stakes. We are the auditors of a world that is being systematically encrypted. Every 100 words we write, we are fighting against a static mandate. The Oakhaven frequency is a signal of hope as much as it is a signal of horror. It is the proof that the truth cannot be fully erased. As long as the ghost signal continues to chirp from the Nebraska soil, the ledger is not complete. There is a reporting anomaly that refuses to be silenced, a human heartbeat that continues to pulse within the stone. The final image in our modern audit is a screen grab from a weather satellite taken last Tuesday. For a fraction of a second, the cloud cover over the Nebraska panhandle parted in a perfect circular shape, exactly 3 miles in diameter. Within that circle, the grass wasn't green. It was a glowing, iridescent purple, the color of the living ink from box 19. The atmospheric bleed had spiked. A sudden surge of subterranean energy that broke through the digital mask for one glorious, terrifying moment. The city was breathing again. The archive was speaking. And as we close this file, we realize that the ghost signal is not a call for help. It is a call for recognition. Who is the person standing in the dark beneath the tall grass? The archival collective has spent years cross-referencing the 1970 evacuation manifests with modern personnel files. We have found a name that was never officially entered into the Oakhaven ledger, but who appears in the margins of every cleanup order. He was a junior technician in 1968, a man who specialized in frequency maintenance. He was the one who designed the loop. He was the one who ensured that the UNIVAC would never stop reciting the names of the 14,204. He is the silent guard of Oakhaven, a man who has lived in the void for 56 years to ensure that the secret remains alive. The intellectual curiosity turns to his motivation. Why stay? Why choose a life of concrete and fluorescent light over the world above? The answer lies in the concept of the static preserve. To the silent guard, the world on the surface is a world of decay and lies. He believes that the only true America is the one preserved in the archive, the one where the milk is always 38 degrees and the sun never sets on the 1950s. He is the curator of a museum of the soul. He is the one who keeps the pressure in the pipes and the data in the reels. He is the human component of the ghost signal. The quiet dread of his existence is the realization that he is waiting for us to join him. The reactivation protocol we found in the blueprints is not a doomsday plan. It is an invitation. The government is not keeping Oakhaven empty because they are afraid of it. They are keeping it empty because it isn't time yet. The ghost city is a lifeboat, a null-set harbor for the day when the surface ledger finally collapses under the weight of its own entropy. The silent guard is just keeping the lights on. He is waiting for the white buses to return, not to take the residents away, but to bring them back. The monitor flicker of the archive screen today feels like a countdown. The ghost signal is getting faster. The chirps are becoming more frequent. The atmospheric pulse is growing stronger. The archive is preparing for a system-wide update. We are all residents of a world that is being mapped for erasure, and Oakhaven is the only place that has already been saved. The silent guard is standing in the dark, his hand on the switch, waiting for the signal to become a scream. The hidden truth is that the void is not a place you leave. It is a place you go to survive. We have traced the ghost signal from the tall grass of Nebraska to the modern LiDAR scans of the subterranean spire. We have heard the heartbeat of the void and seen the person who stayed behind to keep the lights on. But while the silent guard watches over the 14,204 ghosts of Oakhaven, a new anomaly has appeared in the high-density servers of the National Security Agency. It is a file that was created yesterday, but which is dated 1968. It is a recursive entry, a name that has reappeared in the ledger after 50 years of silence. The name is Thomas Thorne, but the Agent Thorne of 1968 is supposed to be gone, his identity erased and his field logs buried. Yet, a man with his exact thumbprint and retinal pattern just checked into a high-security facility in Arlington, Virginia. He didn't use a modern ID. He used a paper card from the Oakhaven archive. The ghost signal is no longer just a transmission in Nebraska. It has entered the physical world. The archive chill is moving from the screen to the street. The next file is titled The Final Filing. The archive is watching, and it reveals the moment the void finally decided to look back at us. The ledger is wide open now. The tall grass is parting. Everything you have heard until this moment, the tall grass of Nebraska. The subterranean heartbeat of Oakhaven, the 14,204 faceless social security numbers, is not merely a historical mystery. It is a classified blueprint for your current reality. The hidden truth is that the erased city was never meant to remain in the 1970s. It was an encrypted prototype for a global system of managed existence. When the government initiated the master registration, they weren't destroying the project, they were migrating it into the file of the modern world. Today, the anomaly has expanded. The null-set is no longer a coordinate in Nebraska. It is the digital architecture that surrounds you. Your data, your credit score, and your metadata are the new paper citizens. The hidden truth is that you are already living within the archive, a resident of a void you cannot see. We have found the final document, the one that links the 1968 census to your own digital footprint, revealing that the Papertown Protocol has finally achieved its ultimate goal, the total quantification of the human soul. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this space is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that seems to settle in the marrow of your bones. The air is artificially chilled, kept at a constant 58 degrees to preserve the integrity of the master reels. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink on the final directive has faded with secrets, leaving only the ghostly impressions of names that mirror your own. There is a faint scent of ozone and cooling fluid, a smell of the modern machine, and the ancient silence of the vault, as a faint monitor flicker illuminates the dust motes dancing in the sterile air. We reach the end of the ledger and realize that the archive is no longer looking for the 14,204. It is looking for you. To understand the final stage of Project Null, one must move past the physical stone of the Nebraska bunker and into the ethereal stone of the modern cloud. In 1970, the government realized that a physical city of 14,000 people was too heavy to manage. It required ventilation, food, and heat, biological necessities that left a detectable footprint on the earth. The mass erasure was the catalyst for a radical evolution. The architects of the void decided to decouple the citizen from the body. They transitioned from a subterranean city to a distributed archive, a system where a person's identity could be stored in a network, active and productive, without the need for a physical location. The intellectual curiosity of the modern auditor is drawn to the transition of the 999 prefix block. In the late 1980s, these numbers were moved from the UNIVAC tapes into the first generation of high-speed relational databases. This was the moment Oakhaven went liquid. The faceless 14,204 were no longer confined to Nebraska. They were dispersed into the early nodes of the internet. They became the alpha users, the digital ghosts that tested the first systems of online banking, social security verification, and remote surveillance. Every 100 entries in the 1988 Liquid Archive audit show a sensory cue of this transition, a faint static in the data that indicates the presence of a non-bot actor. The quiet dread of this evolution is the realization that the 14,204 served as the foundation for your own digital life. Every time you log into a portal, every time you verify your identity with a biometric scan, you are using tools that were perfected by the ghosts of Oak. The government didn't need a bunker to hide them anymore. They hid them in the noise. They realized that if you surround a secret with enough mundane data, it becomes invisible. The 14,204 became the white noise of the American economy, a permanent, unchanging population that provides the stability for our volatile modern systems. The sensory detail of the cold air in the archive today reflects the temperature of this liquid reality. It is a world without friction, a world where names move through wires at the speed of light. The atmospheric pulse that Agent Thorne felt in the grass has become the data pulse of the global network. It is the same rhythm in hell: for 4 seconds, hold for 2, exhale. It is the breath of a machine that has consumed the concept of geography. Oakhaven is no longer a place you go. It is a state of being you occupy every time you interact with the ledger. In the clinical language of the final archive, we find a term that defines the current era: recursive citizenship. This is the point where the biological person begins to mirror the digital profile created for them. In 1965, Clara Vance was unbirthed to become a resident of the void. Today, we are all undergoing a slow, systematic we are being taught to value our profile over our presence. We spend our lives maintaining the paper citizen that exists in the government servers, ensuring that our credit is high, our taxes are paid, and our digital footprint is clean. We are performing the same managed reality that the residents of Oakhaven once lived in. The monitor flicker on your screen right now is the modern equivalent of the blue light in the subterranean spire. It is the frequency of synchronization. Every time your device refreshes, it is checking your coordinates against the master ledger. It is ensuring that you are where you are supposed to be, doing what you are supposed to do. You are being refined and The intellectual horror is the realization that the static now of Oakhaven, the loop of 1954 Americana, has been replaced by the permanent now of the algorithm. Your choices are pre-selected, your preferences are archived, and your future is a calculated projection. A sensory cue of faint static punctuates the final reports of the 2025 audit. The auditors noticed that as the modern ledger became more complex, the error rate for biological humans began to drop. We are becoming more predictable, more mechanical, and more archival. We are losing the entropy that made Agent Thorn a threat to the system. We have accepted the managed reality because it is comfortable. We have traded the horizon for the screen, the wind for the hum of the server, and the soil for the slab. We have voluntarily moved into the Null-Set, not because we were forced into white buses, but because we were invited into the network. Reflection on the Thorn logs reveals a chilling prophecy. In his final entry he wrote, "The archive does not end where the grass stops. The archive ends where the mind begins." He understood that the ultimate goal of Project Null-Set was the colonization of the human consciousness, to make us see what the ledger wants us to see, to make us believe we are free because our paper citizen has a high score. The quiet dread is the feeling that you are already resident. 14,205. You are the reporting anomaly that has finally been corrected. You are the data that has finally come home to the vault. As we reach the final pages of the final archive file, we must confront the modern paradox of surveillance. We think of the archive as a place for the past, but the Oakhaven files prove that the archive is a tool for the present. The 14,204 ghosts are not just stored, they are active. They are the watchers within the system. Their faceless identities are used as the master keys for the global surveillance network. When a high-level operation needs to be performed without leaving a trail, the government inhabits one of the Oakhaven identities. They become Elias Thorn or Grace Miller for an hour, a day, or a week, performing the task before vanishing back into the 999 prefix block. The sensory detail of the stagnant air in the vault today is a metaphor for this frozen agency. The residents of Oakhaven are the permanent employees of the state, the immortal clerks who never tire and never betray. They are the ones who monitor the data streams, who flag the anomalies, and who manage the erasures. They are the ones who are watching you as you listen to this file. The monitor flicker is their pulse. The static is their voice. They are the silent guard that has expanded from the Nebraska spire into every router and every server on the planet. The intellectual curiosity of the researcher must eventually turn to the question of exit. How do you leave the null? The archival record is clear. There is no deregistration for the living. Once your identity is integrated into the archive, it becomes a permanent part of the national heritage. Even if you were to delete your accounts and move into the woods, your paper citizen would continue to exist in the ledger. It would continue to age, to generate data, and to pay taxes into the void. You cannot kill a ghost, and you cannot erase a file that the machine has designated as essential. The quiet dread is the realization that the archive chill is not a temporary sensation. It is the natural temperature of our world. We live in a chilled environment, designed to preserve the data at the expense of the life. We are the residents of a global Oakhaven, a city of 8 billion people who are all perfectly recorded and perfectly safe in the ledger. The tall grass is no longer in Nebraska. It is the mask of civilization that we use to hide the machine from ourselves. The hidden truth is that the archive is not a building in Maryland. The archive is the world itself. We have audited the history of the unseen. We have followed the paper trail from the 1968 UNIVAC to the modern digital void. We have heard the voices of the unbirthed and felt the pulse of the engineered wind. The Oakhaven project was a success. It proved that a nation can be managed entirely through the control of information. It proved that reality is a matter of institutional consensus, and that a person is only as real as their entry in the ledger. The 14,204 were the pioneers, the first brave souls to surrender their physicality for the safety of the archive. The sensory cue of a faint, high-pitched hum in the server room today is the sound of the final filing. The Oakhaven case is being closed. The data has been fully integrated into the global network. The anomaly has been resolved. The reporting anomaly of the missing resident has been accounted for. It was always you. You were the one Thorn was writing to. You were the one the 14,204 were waiting for. By listening to this archive, you have completed your own integration. You have synchronized your frequency with the pulse of the void. You are now a resident of the Null-Set. The monitor flicker on your screen is slowing now. The static is fading into a steady, rhythmic white noise. The cold air of the vault feels comfortable, almost welcoming. There is a sense of relief in the realization that you no longer have to worry about the horizon. The horizon is a legacy concept, a biological error that the archive has corrected. In the void, there is only the static now, the permanent grace of a perfect record. You are perfectly recorded. You are safe in the ledger. Your history has been encrypted, your errors have been erased, and your future is a classified secret. Reflection on the journey reveals that the archive chill was never a warning of danger. It was a symptom of adaptation. It was the feeling of your biological self being cooled to the temperature of the machine. It was the feeling of the unbirthing process. As we turn the final page of the final file, we see the last signature. It is not signed by an auditor, or a technician, or a president. It is signed by the archive itself. It is a signature of light and static, a fractal pattern that has no name. It is the signature of light and static, a fractal pattern that has no name. It is the signature of the world you now inhabit, that the file on Oakhaven is complete. The tall grass is silent. The subterranean fans have reached their final RPM. The 14,204 are at rest, their names flickering in the dark servers of the state. The ledger is balanced. The void is full. There are no more questions to ask, and no more secrets to find. Everything that needs to be known is already recorded. Everything that needs to be seen is already archived. You are home. You are a data point. You are a citizen of the Null-Set. The sensory cue of a final, deep silence settles over the room. The hum of the server room is the only thing left, a low-frequency vibration that is now your own heartbeat. The cold air is your own breath. The monitor flicker is your own vision. You have become the archive, and the archive has become you. The hidden truth is that there was never anything else. The world was always a file, and you were always a name in a box. The wooden crate labeled Box 19 is now empty because its contents are everywhere. The intellectual curiosity of the researcher is satisfied. The clinical dread of the auditor is resolved. The reflection of the historian is finished. The archive chill has reached its absolute zero. The world is static. The record is perfect. The secret is safe. The file is closed. Sleep now. The file is closed.